I'd like to introduce Dennis Simmons, Cowper, his bush name. He's Indigenous leader, filmmaker, and my brother. So thanks, Dennis.
Kaya, nunga pwede nunga ngala kwenye, welcome to nunga country. Jinjin mwenye nunga kina kore nunga pwedera, wacha pwedera. May the spirits of our land follow you wherever you walk in this country. I'd like to thank Cruiser for inviting me down here to have an opportunity just to welcome you guys here to the country, and it's quite heartening to see a lot of people here because for me as a Yunga man in Yunga country, it's very concerning the way that things are going. For me as a father, it's very concerning. For me as a grandfather, it's very concerning. And the gap between Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people is now closed. But not for health, only for fighting for our rights. So I just like to welcome everyone to the fight, because right now, common decency, common sense, things that we take for granted, they're all under attack. We're in a mining boom. We live in a state that's going to be mined inside out. We've got a Liberal government that just waltzed in without even introducing any policies, with a job that barely even spoke, and they rolled in there. They brought media, everything is up for sale. Money is the most important thing. Spirituality is gone. And as West Australians, we need to be very concerned about the way things are going, because we're not going to get any support from Labor, and I think it's time for the Greens to step up a little bit as a bigger party and give us something that we can latch onto so that we can take care of family, because we ain't going to get it from anywhere else. So yeah, it's good to see a good turnout here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Dennis. My name is Colin, Penter. I'm one of the organisers with Karun, and I'll just make a few introductory comments and then I'll introduce Anthony and Scott. I would like just to acknowledge Alan from Crow Books over here. Thank you, Alan. Alan's selling about 5 of Anthony's books there, so please give your business to Anthony, and particularly to Alan at Crow Books. If you don't know Crow Books in Victoria Park, it's the best bookstore in Perth. So good luck, Alan, and thanks for your help. I just want to put in some context how tonight came about. Some of us were discussing after the state and federal election a lot of the myth-making that was around at the time and still is about how the state and federal election represented a victory for the right and a loss for the left, which is untrue. We were told that left and progressive movements were no longer relevant, which again is not true. And we were told that people, by their vote, were more attracted to conservative ideas, which again we know is not true. And Anthony will touch on some of those issues tonight. So whilst left views and ideas might have minimal influence in the corridors of the corporate and political elite. That's certainly not the case when you go out and talk to everyday people. And those of you who do that will know that there's actually a great deal of sympathy for the causes that many of us here work for and fight for. And certainly Anthony and Scott will talk about that tonight. One thing I do want to mention, of course, is that one of the things that is very noticeable in Anthony's book is that he's taken time, unlike a lot of journalists, to actually come to Western Australia and to investigate what happens here. So if you read his book, Prophets of Doom, you'll see that 3 of the chapters specifically and directly relate to this state. And Anthony came here, he spoke with many people here, and he visited sites including Curtin Detention Centre, Christmas Island, and Broome. So there's chapters in here about James Price Point, there's chapters in here about Christmas Island Detention Centre, and there's a chapter in here about Curtin Detention Centre and the detention centres in Western Australia. He's also written stuff around the Barnett government that no other journalist in this country has written. So, and it's great to see it's great to see people here tonight who represent and who carry some of the history of the grassroots campaigns from the left here in Western Australia. And I see Joe Valentine here, and as we always do, Joe, it's great to see you. And Rosemary Miller here from the United Church. There's plenty of others, I won't mention you all, who are here who have a long history of campaigning from the left. I think that's important because we often forget the successes, and there's been 3 successes that are very pronounced in our contemporary situation here in Western Australia that really have come about because of campaigning from the left. And one of them, of course, was what happened at James Price Point and the resistance to Woodside's campaign and the Barnett government's support of Woodside. Secondly, of course, is some of the issues that Dennis mentioned, and particularly the current negotiations and campaigning around the Noongar claim on land in the southwest of Western Australia. That's, for many of you will know, that's been a 30 or 40 year campaign that's still underway. And of course, one that's very contemporary that some people are probably unaware of is that the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which some of you will be aware of, that was implemented recently, and of course we now expect to be partly privatised, came about as a result of a lot of early work from disability campaigners in this state. So West Australia was a key place out of which a lot of disability campaigning got the issue that led to the NDIS on the agenda. So it's important for us not to forget that Western Australia has a long and proud history of campaigning from the left, and hopefully the purpose of tonight is to enable us all to continue that. Essentially what we'll do tonight is I'll introduce Anthony and Scott. Anthony will talk for about 25 minutes, and then Scott will respond, and then Anthony and Scott will, I guess, have a bit of a dialogue, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments from the floor. And we'll need to do that reasonably controlled. We've got a mic that will circulate around. Most of you here will know something about Anthony, but you may not know the full background. Anthony is an independent and freelance journalist. He's also a blogger, a photographer, and a documentarian. Is that the word? Yeah. There's the word, good. He's also one of the few journalists, and this was really, I think, one of the things that initially attracted me to Anthony's work was that Anthony's a journalist who dispels that illusion of objective journalism that we have tossed down our throat all the time. And so, for me, Anthony was very much in the mould of John Pilger, who his journalism came from and out of the left, and he is still very committed to journalism that isn't objective. He's a prolific author, so I think there's 7 books. Is that right, Anthony? 7? Lost track of numbers. There's about 5 of them here, and he's going at about the rate of 2 a year, which is for someone who's churning out a lot of articles. To write 2 books a year is pretty remarkable. The latest book is Prophets of Doom, and he's also got a second book out at the moment called, if I can remember it, For God's Sake, thank you, which is about the role of religion and faith in politics. And he also published a book last year, which is directly relevant to tonight, called Left Turn. Was it Left Turn?
Yeah.
Yep. With Jeff Sparrow, who some of you will know Jeff, who edits Overland, who I think is, with Anthony, one of the best writers from the left in Australia. So if you follow Jeff's work and Overland, you'll find it tremendously challenging. So Anthony and Jeff edited that book, and he also had a book out last year called After Zionism, which looked at Israel. And he's also had a couple other books, 2 of which are here tonight, which are bestsellers. He writes weekly for The Guardian. He also writes for The Nation and Huffington Post, which are left online US magazines, and the Sydney Morning Herald, which probably not left really, is it? Anthony, no. The Israeli paper Haaretz, which some of you, is that how you say Haaretz? Is that a left? Not such a thing in Israel. Israel, yeah. Ish. And he appears on the BBC, Al Jazeera, ABC, and many other media outlets, and some of you would have heard him on ABC, 6PR and RTR here this week. So Anthony, welcome, and thank you for coming across, and I would also acknowledge Karun from the Curtin Centre for Human Rights Education, who made it possible for Anthony to come to Perth, so thanks, Caroline. Most of you will know Scott, of course. Scott is the Greens, West Australian Greens Centre, along with Rachel Seaward, one of 2 Greens senators, elected in 207, and hopefully, I think we're all hoping, re-elected in 214. But he might tell us a bit more about that tonight. I won't say a lot about Scott. You all know Scott's significance to us here in Western Australia, and you would have seen, I think I saw today, that Scott making comments that you wouldn't hear from another politician in Australia, being critical of America. So, as you know, Scott is one of the few journalists, politicians willing to speak out on issues that a lot of us feel strongly about. So Scott, welcome and thank you. I'll hand over to Anthony. Thank you all for coming, and I'll ask Anthony just to make a few comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to start off by thanking a few people. I wouldn't be here without them. Colin and Karun, who organised tonight. Alan for organising my books. Scott for being here tonight. You all for being here. Caroline Flay from Curtin Uni, who assisted in my trip coming over to WA this week. And it's been actually a fantastic week. I've spent a lot more time in WA in the last years than a lot of other journalists, and that's been something I've done happily. I think the problem with so much of mainstream journalism is in the moment, and I'll talk about this throughout my address, and I touch on it in much of my work, is that journalism and journalists these days are very much divided between insiders and outsiders. And insiders are those little charming people who appear on Insiders on ABC, that woefully appalling show, but proudly wear that badge with honour to say, we are close to power, isn't that a wonderful thing? And there are other journalists, of which there are not as many in Australia as we'd like, who are outsiders, who proudly are outsiders, who report on issues in Australia or overseas, who don't get embedded. And embedding has become a term that's been quite known since 9/11, but embedding is not just in a physical sense. Embedding does not just mean being with US troops in Afghanistan or Iraq. It means psychologically as well. Do you see yourself being embedded with the system, with journalists, with advisors, with politicians? And there was an interesting study that came out last year through UTS in Sydney, which found that on one particular day, 70% of news stories across the press, ABC, Fairfax, News Limited, 70% were sourced from press releases. And that's not that surprising, but it's a bit worrying for self-evident reasons. And this, I think, is why independent journalism is important. This is one of the reasons I wrote this book, and I've been doing this for about 10 years. And no one does it for the glory and the money, believe me. I certainly don't do it for the money. And Prophets of Doom came out of a number of different conversations I had. About 3 years ago, the book was a 3-year process. And I've been reading a couple of particular books, which many of you will know. Jeremy Scahill, who's an American journalist who wrote a book called Blackwater in 2007, and Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, also in 2007, both different books. But what they were articulating, and Naomi Klein is Canadian and Scahill is American from Brooklyn, was discussing the ways in which the US post 9/11, and Naomi Klein discusses life pretty much from the 70s onwards, has become a way that corporations have become more powerful than the state. They weren't the first people to say this, and nor were they the last, and I argue that in my book as well. And I give various examples of how that's worked in relation to politics, war, and climate change particularly. And this gave me the idea that in so much of journalism and so much of the work that we do to consume media, all of us do that here every day, we actually really look at, or the media really looks at the corporations that are behind, for example, detention centres. Many of you in this room might know this, but many Australians do not. But all the detention centres in Australia and on the mainland, and also Christmas Island and Manus and Nauru, are run by private corporations, for profit, of course. They are run in a way that is incredibly lacking in accountability. Serco, the British multinational, which I know is well known in WA, runs all the centres in Australia on the mainland and Christmas Island, and other corporations run the centres, about to say factories, which they are in a weird kind of way, in Manus Island and Nauru. And the story behind that, I won't bore you with the entire details of that, I go into it in the book, but I wanted to give a couple of examples about how the rot has set in so badly. When Labor was in opposition until 2007, I guess they're back there now, the lucky dears, which is where they should remain permanently in my view, but there's a sense somehow that Labor was talking about how the evils of outsourcing detention centres. And it's very interesting going back now, looking at the record of people like in the comments, public comments by Jerry Gillard and Tony Burke and Kevin Rudd, who were saying during the Howard years, and let's not forget that mandatory detention was started by Labor, not Liberal, but nonetheless during the Howard years it was deepened and enforced far stronger, that detention centres run for profit are fundamentally against the nature of what Australia should be. That how can you have a situation where you have centres that are run for profit for the most vulnerable people who we are facing every day, which is asylum seekers from anywhere, Iran, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Afghanistan. Labor comes in 2007, and surprisingly the promise was broken pretty quickly, and by 2009 Serco, the British multinational, scored that contract. It was a $370 million contract for roughly 8 centres on the mainland and Christmas Island. You fast forward to 2013, now we're in early November, and that contract is worth $1.86 billion. Now yes, a lot has happened in the last 4 years. We all know there's been a surge of boats and the situation has changed. And one of the things I talk about in the book, which is what I think too few journalists and those in the public do see, is the reality about what that privatisation means for not just the asylum seekers, which are clearly the important part, but also the guards and the people who work for these corporations in often remote locations. And I visited Curtin and Christmas Island, the detention centres, and I visited Villawood. I live in Sydney, so I visited Villawood, which is sort of on the outskirts of suburban Sydney. And one of the things that strikes you about these places is they're not concentration camps in the kind of despotic way that we might imagine. They're not. However, and there's a very important caveat, they are the kind of centres that create misery by definition. And one of the remarkable things that I found in the writing of this book, and this came from internal documents that I got from a whistleblower who works for Serco still. I can't say his name, but he's a very, very senior manager who was there from the beginning, and he still is there, believe it or not, for reasons that only he can know when he puts his head on the pillow at night, after what he told me, that when there was a surge in boats in the last 4 years, and the centres were bulging, and they couldn't handle the number of people who were coming, there was an obvious presumption that there'd be more staff hired, that you need to have more people to manage the refugees who are arriving. This is a logical presumption. In fact, the opposite happened. Serco often hired less staff. And the effect of that is almost obvious, that there was a great deal of misery caused in the detention centres, which is self-evident. But the documents that I have show that in fact the system is gamed in such a way that although the contract between Serco and the Australian government, which is available only through a hell of a lot of digging and whistleblowers and FOI, pushing by myself and a few other journalists, is that the contract itself that was signed in 2009 and has been changed in various ways since then, it's roughly the same now in 2013, has mechanisms for transparency. They're there in theory. But what this gentleman told me and many other people who work for Serco said, the system is gamed in such a way that both parties have a good reason to not make the system work. What that means is that when something goes wrong, or there is a so-called breach, or there is an attempted suicide, which is happening daily, I might add, in many centres around the country and offshore, that Serco managers are directed and told from head office in Sydney, do not report those breaches, because if you do, A, you'll be fired, and B, that will incur a fine from the federal government. So you can see how the system is quite effective. I use that term with inverted commas. It's effective because it allows both parties to benefit. Serco clearly is looking to make profit, that's its nature, it's a capitalist company, that's not exactly a revelation. But the government relies on Serco, and the relationship is so toxic and, in my view, unhealthy, that when you're a journalist or an average citizen or anyone who wants to find out what the hell is going on in these centres, in these factories of cruelty, you speak to the government and they say speak to Serco and vice versa. And that's exactly how, that's the aim. And this is not unique to Australia. One of the things that you find when you look at this issue is, although our situation is unique on one hand, that there are no other countries that I know of that have detention centres in the Pacific. That's fairly unique, unfortunately. But the US and the UK obviously has massive immigration detention centres for both immigrants and visa overstays, etc. And they're often run by private companies. And the remarkable thing is that the Australian government, Labor or Liberal, knows the records of these centres. There are government reports, not written by NGOs, although them as well, but by government reports that detail exactly the reality of what is happening in these centres. So I looked at that in the book and was saying there is another way to do this. There's another way that refugees and asylum seekers can be managed. I have a personal view that we should have open borders, which is not particularly politically appealing to a lot of people, maybe ever, but nonetheless, it's a view that I have. But in reality, I think the system itself could be radically changed to actually not produce people who are traumatised. That, to me, should be a key reason of what detention should be about. If you have detention at all, my view is there should be no mandatory detention. And as Colin was saying initially, there's a perception, I think, out there that left views are unpopular. And on some issues, electorally, the reality speaks for itself. We have a conservative government in your state and in my state and federally. But the remarkable thing is when it comes to privatisation in all states, and this is not unique to Australia, you have public opinion polls that clearly say that most of the public are opposed to privatisation. When it comes to water or electricity, the facts are there. Now you could argue, so why is it still happening? That's a political and democracy problem rather than anything else. And I think there's a way that can be harnessed, that opposition which is there. And I know certain unions in WA who are trying to push that, and I hope in the next years that becomes stronger. So I looked at the detention centre question here, and in the US and the UK. I also examined, and I'll explain the connection between these in a minute, the outsourcing and privatisation of war and intelligence post 9/11. Now, privatising war has been happening forever. It's not particularly new. It's been, if you look back at history, in fact, the East India Company was a private army, essentially. The difference now is the scale and the globalised nature of it. So 9/11 happens, and there's a remarkable speech on, in fact, September the 10th, 2001, by Donald Rumsfeld, the then Defence Secretary of the US, on the Bush administration. And he gives a speech the day before 9/11 where he says, and I'm paraphrasing, that the real problem and the enemy of America is waste. The real enemy here is the Defence Department is so bloated, his words, we need to outsource far more. Why the hell, when we go to war, so he says, should the army be cooking for our troops? That could be outsourced. Why are we managing all these things ourselves? 9/11 happens the following day. The US goes to war in Afghanistan in October 2001. They go to Iraq in March 2003. And you have a massive expansion of privatisation with countless companies, DynCorp, Blackwater, there are others, who have huge contracts, mostly without tender, to so-called manage the war. And the reality of that, and I spent time in Afghanistan and Pakistan last year looking at this, is that in so many cases, putting aside the human rights abuses, which are not minimal, you realise there's actually very little accountability for how this works. So you have an insurgency in both countries, Iraq and Afghanistan, to resist occupation. And you realise when you spend time talking to private intelligence officers and soldiers and other contractors, that the reason, for example, the private intelligence, and what intelligence means is that, and I got some leaks of information that is passed to the US to tell them what is going on in the war. You have local Afghan companies who are being hired by the US military to tell them what is happening in a certain village. And the transcript literally will be something like, Mohammed says to Ahmed, you know, I'm really upset at what the Americans are doing here in my village. Oh, I go, so really? They have a bit of an exchange. Mundane. Mostly mundane. Often mundane. And the effect of that can be, and there's very clear evidence to connect one to the other, that so-called night raids, many of you will have heard of this term, and night raids happening every night in Afghanistan, often led by US and Afghan forces, and often with Australian forces too, arrives at a village, a random village in Afghanistan, a poor village, and helicopters and a lot of noise and drama, and individuals are taken, I would argue, kidnapped for interrogation, sometimes they're killed. It's happening nightly. And the intelligence that's often used to action those kind of missions are often from intelligence services. And the remarkable thing is when I spend time there and speaking to countless people about this issue is that the reason they're using private intelligence and companies who are doing it for profit is they actually don't know why they're not liked. Now, that might sound like a sort of flippant thing to say in a way, like why are people occupying and they're pissed off, they're going to fight back. Yes, that's still evident to us. But the remarkable thing is that the US government, elements within the US government, the Defence Department, who are fighting these wars, actually are unclear what the sources of the opposition are, apart from the broad brushstrokes. Yes, they don't like us occupying their country, okay, but we're giving them assistance, we're building things for them, so they tell themselves. And the reason private intelligence is therefore used with these corporations that often are doing it for the wrong kind of reasons is exactly that, to inform the US what the hell is going on literally down the road from their base. And what I argue in the book, and I show through various evidence, is that if you actually do believe that if America's going to go to war, which it does like to do a lot, and we always like to follow. I did like, by the way, as an aside, that Tony Abbott this week, our dear leader, who was in Afghanistan for about 5 minutes, with the other potential future dear leader, Billy Shorten, was talking about how it's not a victory or a defeat in Afghanistan. Australia never is about occupying a country, it's about bringing freedom. I'm paraphrasing the great workman himself, but what was remarkable about that statement was that actually goes to the heart of the problem here, which is self-evident in this kind of audience. But the reason why there is so much profound ignorance about why those wars went wrong is exactly what I'm saying. They actually don't know what local people are saying or thinking because they generally don't talk to them or deal with them. That's the reality of a garrisoned war. You are behind walls and a ghetto. And yes, there's some interaction with Afghan forces or Iraqi forces, but mostly you don't have that kind of interaction. Therefore, you need to hire private companies to tell you what's going on and why you're not liked very much. Go figure. Let me briefly explain a few other things I looked at and then I'll have a chat to Scott. I also went to Papua New Guinea in Bougainville, and for those who don't know, Bougainville is a province in Papua New Guinea. It's not that talked about in Australia, but there was a massive Rio Tinto mine there that was open until the late 90s. Huge, huge mine, incredibly polluting mine, and locals, I'm giving a very short version of what happened, short history. Locals opposed the massive pollution and human rights abuses that were happening there, and they rose up and they fought Rio Tinto and the Australian government who provide arms and support for the the PNG Army and Rio Tinto. The locals won, in short, but at a massive price. 15,000, 20,000 locals were killed. And you go to Bougainville today, which you can get to. Until relatively recently, it was not that easy safely for white folk to go, but now it's, I wouldn't say it's a tourist mecca, but it's certainly changed in the last 5 years. And you go to vast tracts of Bougainville and you see just sandy white nothingness, which used to be lush forests. And this was caused by the tailings, the so-called waste from the mine. And the reason this is relevant today, apart from simply human rights and accountability question, is the fact that there is pressure to reopen the mine today. And this pressure is coming not just from Rio Tinto, that you'd expect, but from the Australian government. And it's coming through AusAid, our aid arm, who are giving money to the Bougainville government to draft legislation to make it much easier for Rio Tinto to return. So our aid dollars, again, going to partly a private corporation and a government in Bougainville which is looking to re-enter the mining game because they want independence. This is what it's contributing to. And I looked at the evidence and the details about how that works and the reality of what that means for the local population, most of whom oppose the reopening of the mine. Most realise there's been no accountability about the environmental destruction last time. And the alternatives to that are rarely if ever discussed. For those of you who don't know, AusAid has a program now called Sustainable Mining. And their words, not mine. And sustainable mining is something that became quite real to me when I was in Afghanistan last year, and I was spending time with an Afghan woman who's a parliamentarian there, which is a pretty brave act when you realise that women particularly, and men, are executed quite regularly by unknown figures. Then she was about to head to Canberra on a mining exploration trip. And the Australian government was bringing her and a number of other Afghan ministers to see how wonderfully well we do it here. Well, let's be honest what this is about. This is not really about saying, oh, we do things wonderfully. It's about allowing Australian companies access to the massive, potentially $1 trillion resource industry in Afghanistan. That's the prize. That's the prize. And that's the prize in PNG, and that's the prize in many places. DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, is called DFAT for a reason. Foreign Affairs and Trade. It's not separate, it's together. And I'm not saying that Australian aid never does anything good. It does. But too often, this is what I talk about in relation to PNG and Afghanistan as well, the same corporations, for-profit corporations, are making a hell of a lot of money from our aid dollars. And often the reality of how that's not helping individuals, locals in these countries, is rarely if ever discussed, and it should be discussed because our tax dollars for one, and secondly, locals are not benefiting from what we claim that they are. Finally and briefly, Haiti. Haiti is a country, as you know, close to the US, 3 hours or so by plane from New York. It's independent nominally, and one of the remarkable things, the reason I went to Haiti was because it's almost the classic example of a country that has invaded, as some estimates have, the most number of NGOs there in the world. And for many people on the left, I'm guessing this room, apart from any ASIO spies, hello, it could be on the left, I guess that's possible. Maybe on the far left, which would be even nicer. That the concept, I think, of Haiti being a republic of NGOs, that was the term that I heard when I was there, is on the left often we have an idealised view of an NGO. NGOs are there to help. NGOs are there to assist the population. And I'm not saying for a second there aren't great NGOs doing good work in the world. There are. However, there are so many cases in so many countries of for-profit NGOs that are doing damage, that actually are not helping. They're doing less than helping, they're actually harming a country. And this became very clear to me when WikiLeaks documents, and as an aside, WikiLeaks often gets pretty bad rap in certain circles in the world these days, but in terms of the work I've done, the documents that they've released in the last 3 or 4 years have been utterly invaluable in every country I've visited, including here in Australia. And people, journalists, if they're serious about their work, should actually, in my view, acknowledge that. But in Haiti, just after the earthquake in January 2010, the then US ambassador sent a cable back to the US, and I detail that in the book. And it's really interesting because what he says is the gold rush is on. Now what the gold rush means is business opportunities are rife. US corporations and for-profit NGOs need to come down here to Haiti and make a killing. And that's exactly what has happened. So Haiti is nominally independent, as I said. It has a the government, which is essentially a US client, but nonetheless it has a government of sorts. And after all these years of aid and development and support of the same corporations often that are involved in Papua New Guinea and Afghanistan, and including some here, most of the work, although not all, has been utterly not just useless but futile. And when you speak to a lot of Haitians, as I did, and I hope to go back there in a few months, I'm working on a film in relation to this book, sort of related to the book. The thing that often strikes you is you have huge, massive refugee camps in the middle of Port-au-Prince, which is the capital of Haiti. These are refugees in their own country who suffered after the earthquake in January 2010, and they say to me and others, we haven't seen any of the money. Where is the money that's coming from the US and the UN, from a range of other factors? And to make matters worse in Haiti, without wishing to make you too depressed, the UN sent troops to assist Haiti after the earthquake, and some of the troops were from Nepal. And again, to cut a long story short, the Nepalese troops brought cholera to the country. There hadn't been cholera in Haiti for over 100 years. Fast forward to now, late 2013, and there's been 8,500 Haitians who have died from cholera, hundreds of thousands of those who have been affected, and the UN refused to take responsibility and pay any compensation. It's an absolute outrage, to put it mildly, and shows, in fact, that the UN is a, frankly, rather damaged or broken body, but I digress. How all this connects, and why I talk about this in the book, is to say that there's an alternative way. That although there's mountains of evidence about how the world is ordered and how often this is ordered in a way we don't read about in the corporate press, there are some exceptions, which is why often I like the comments by Noam Chomsky, where he's often asked what his favourite newspaper is. He goes, the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal. And in some ways I agree with him, because that's actually the papers that you understand how the world works. It's unfettered, and it's clear, and it's brutal. We're here to make money. Let's be clear about this. We're here to make money. And human rights are a kind of an inconvenience at best. And I'd encourage you, if you can hold your nose for a while, read those papers. Don't pay money for them, obviously. But read those papers to understand how the world works, because that actually is, in some ways, a manual to how not to do it. And the idea behind the book was to say, in all these countries, including our own, including in WA, people are resisting what is going on. Mostly they're not known, they're mostly not heralded, they mostly don't get coverage in the corporate press or the front page of the West or, God forbid, or the Australian or in Australia or the Herald Sun or whatever it may be. But they are doing work, and they need to be supported and encouraged in whatever way that may be. And in a broader question is about what vulture capitalism, the book is subtitled How Vulture Capitalism is Swallowing the World. And what I mean by that, I guess, is to say that now the corporations become more powerful than the state, we have a responsibility to say that there is a different way here, that if we simply allow a bipartisan mentality or reality, this is bipartisan, it doesn't really matter who's in power here, Labor, Liberal, there are differences, but they're minor, very minor. But we're going to see probably an acceleration now, privatisation under Tony Abbott, that's true. But stuff was happening under Labor, let's be honest about that. In the US, Obama he talks nicely, doesn't he? That's about all he does really do. But before he won in 2008, he talked about changing that culture. Nothing has changed. And the UK, there's a classic case of the Cameron Tory government putting in place even more extreme versions of Serco and G4S, two multinationals getting even more contracts, although they're in the middle of a scandal at the moment. But there's a different way, and there are groups that are putting forward those models. I don't go into massive detail about that in the book, but I say when people often lose hope, and so often, and I'm sure in this room, this feeling comes up a lot. We do say to ourselves, the challenges are so huge, and the mountain seems so high, without wishing to use too many other cliches. How do we actually challenge that? How do we actually find a way to imagine a society, a community, a country which is not governed principally by big business or corporates? And there is a way to do that. I don't claim to have all the answers. Any journalist who says that, or politician, is lying. We don't. But there are ways to at least begin a conversation. To me, so much of it, when our media itself is broken, to have these conversations, these kind of events are even more important. So thank you.
That was fun. We don't get Antony out here very often. Can you please thank him for coming all the way across the world? I would like to give kick off. I'll be really brief because you come here to see me, so I'm going to throw a tricky question at him in a moment, and then we will open the floor to you folk, and you can tell us how to join the dots. I thought what I could do was maybe just add a little bit of political context. I'm not a journalist. I am, for the time being at least, in politics, and we'll see what happens with that. I'd like to also start by acknowledging that we're on Aboriginal ground and say thank you very much for opening the space for us. And I have put at the very top of my to-do list about stepping up and getting to be a larger party. That is now the number one thing for me. But thanks for that acknowledgement and thanks for opening up the space with such grace. When we titled the forum, I don't know whether we gave you any agency in that at all. What's next for the left or something along those lines? What the hell should we do now? Figured that in politics there isn't much left because the centre has moved so much, and really this is a long-run phenomenon, at least since the 1980s, I guess. Things that occurred in the United States and the UK that we kind of took our lead from. Such that growth and the form of industrial capitalism that we're embedded in is now treated as something akin to a religion, and it's come to completely infect the language, particularly political language. Even the word growth, if you get involved in politics, growth is good. Growth is good, and there is nothing you can do about that if you want to play mainstream politics. Growth, of course, means exponential growth that doubles about once a generation and will eventually shatter the biosphere. But you can't actually challenge growth. It's very difficult to do so without automatically being treated as completely on the margin. And you can see if you join the dots in the chapters of this book here, that kind of underlying infection, if you will, difficulty that people have challenging the self-evident good of growth. Productivity is another one. You know, the use of language is tremendously important. Journalists play a particularly important role in this, as do politicians. It's a very tight and somewhat nasty feedback loop. Productivity, who would like to work harder for less money? Nobody put their hands up, so what's wrong with you? You're the reason the economy is in such trouble. Class war. Who's heard that phrase pop out? Have you noticed it's only called class war when people fight back? It's only called class war when people on a minimum wage seek for the minimum wage to be a shade higher. That's known as class war.
What about class struggle?
Hey, Richard. We'll get to that. I can tell who that was without even looking up. And what it comes down to, I guess, is the general sense that whatever is in the corporate interest is in the public interest. That those two things are equivalent. And that's very, very important that we unpack. That sure, sometimes they are, and sometimes they're really not. It is not in the public interest for corporations to be running these for-profit detention centres or prisons, or selling tobacco or uranium, where your job, if you're in that company, whether you're a person of goodwill or not, is growth. You know, if you are in the industry that these people are in, running the detention centres, the last thing you want is for an end to the mandatory detention system. You want growth. You need your industry to be bigger than it was. That's why the tobacco industry is so dangerous. That's why privatising prisons is so dangerous. There's a very interesting and very challenging essay written in the late 1990s by a guy called John McMurtry. It's called The Cancer Stage of Capitalism. It's quite a short essay, and it's a bit of a head spin, actually. He wrote a book by the same title, the same name, in 2012, and it's impenetrable, actually. I challenge any of you to get through all the way through. But the essay is excellent, and it uses biological metaphor that then goes vastly further than metaphor and says, if you're looking for biological analogues to capitalism, the closest thing really to something that is wedded only to growth and self-multiplication, no matter how much harm is done to the society or the biological substrate, the closest analogue really is cancer. Kind of scary when you think about it. Check the essay out. Tell me what you think. From a political point of view, Tony Abbott as Prime Minister would not be possible if our media and elements of our civil society weren't broken. When you think about it, the number of free passes that guy got during the election campaign, up to the point where the News Corp press, who controls 70% of the newspaper circulation in this country, just decided to run his campaign for them. I'm not even thinking of that. But the fact that you can get such a complete free pass tells you something about that element of democracy being broken and an urgent need of self-repair. This work is part of that. The work of WikiLeaks is part of that. Protecting whistleblowers, independent publishers. I would go so far as to say the Guardian opening up here, people experimenting with new forms of online journalism, and what the hell, Perth Indie Media is still operating. You know, we've been doing this here for decades, actually. Go on, Perth Indie Media. And in terms of civil society, and this is not a telling you off, why isn't the environment movement bigger, but we do need to do, I think, a bit of urgent soul searching. I still feel I have a foot in that world. That's kind of where I came from. That we're going to need to step up in the next couple of years. What happened in 2007, after the Labour Party got elected, was a lot of people who'd been working their asses off, including most of you in this room, went off and had a bit of a rest. Really? That's kind of, well, I got elected, I was kind of got even harder from there, but a lot of people just were like, we've kind of got the job done, right? We've got the centre-left thing. Kevin Rudd seems like an okay guy. He speaks Mandarin. He really took it up to John Howard, so we can... and no, actually significant stuff. But the first two things they did, they apologised for the stolen generations. I saw a lot of people crying at that event, and they went off and they signed Kyoto and said climate change is a thing, and actually it was all kind of downhill from there, wasn't it? I might take you up in a second, Antony, on your idea that the Labour Party belongs in opposition. Sounds controversial, but actually that's where they'll find a certain amount of their soul, and what we will find in the next 3 years is that we will rebuild the movement. You can guarantee it, because he's about to smash the shit out of us. I suspect everybody in this room is here, unless you are the ASIO spook. If you are the ASIO spook, please come down to the front and Antony will sign a copy of the book. It's a good book. And if you're not, I suspect you have been deep, Cecil. Wow. If you're not, I suspect you're in this room because you're already doing this work. You didn't come here to be lectured about how to be an activist or campaign. I recognise about half the people here, you're doing this work already. But we had better learn to link arms and support each other a bit better, I think. Whether you're in the trade union movement, whether you're already seeing atrocities being done by that guy with the Operation Sovereign asshole signs behind him, what they are doing to dismantle the architecture wasn't perfect, but actually it was kind of working. That we developed with the Labour Party, to give them their due, and the country independence, to transfer, I don't know, what would it have been, $6 or $7 billion a year from fossil fuel pollution into tax breaks for people on low incomes, energy efficiency and renewable energy. That's in the process of being smashed up now. All of us are going to need to work together and recognise if there's one single thing before I sit down that I hope you would take away is that these are all elements of the same struggle. One of my favourite things about this book is that it takes you from the beach at James Price Point to PNG, and it takes you to Afghanistan. We sometimes think that just because we're in an island, our movement and our struggle is separate from the rest of the world, and of course that's not the case. So a big part of my thinking at the moment would be around the 3-year election cycle and what we can do to make this guy one-term Prime Minister. Now that's something that I guess we could hopefully all aim for, but we actually have to think a little bit beyond that, so that when the pendulum swings back, it swings back so hard they don't know what hit them. But also we have to think outside the political cycles. Parliament has been trying to cope, just as one last example, trying to grapple with the challenge of climate change, which is, for me, is the big one. Nearly everything else we work on is linked with that when you think about it, and if we lose that, we lose everything. And Parliament, we signed on to the Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. From the mid-1990s, Parliament was bringing forward schemes for carbon prices, for energy efficiency, for public transport, for cities. We've been here before. We've been through 2 or 3 turns of this wheel. Parliamentarians from all parties, the Greens don't have a monopoly on this stuff, bringing ideas forward, and then before you know it, throw this mob out on the front page of the newspaper and it all gets dismantled. And now we've been at this for 20 years, and I'm a bit over it.
So we really do need to think about how we can create these kind of changes, not relying on people in Parliament to bring it forward. If civil society was healthy and really angry and the media was working, turning out it wouldn't be possible. I'll leave that thought with you. Thanks very much for being here.
Thank you, Anthony and Scott. What we're going to do is take some questions. Now, we've got one roving mic, so if you've got a loud voice, it might be easier not to use the mic, but Karun's going to be the runner up and down and across, so we might have to manipulate the questions for the moment, depending on ease of access. So feel free, happy to make comments if you like, but if you can try and keep it a question reasonably succinctly, that would be much appreciated. And I've got a question from someone who can't be here, so if you've got questions on behalf of others, feel free to ask those. Did I see you just here? Do you want to fire away? Will you need the mic?
Yeah, we did. Like, we've got a YouTube video going, so we actually want to
Thank you.
have our audience here.
Scott, I really liked what you said about production and having to have growth all the time and what that's doing to our environment. And I've always been one to sort of try and think about what we can replace that with, social capital and other community-minded, because we're all, the community searching for something to fill a void in life. Are there groups, I suppose, I don't know what I'm trying to say here, is there a group of people that are together to try to model something that is an alternative to this sort of growth that we're always trying to have, which society forward?
Good question. And it's a bit of an obsession of mine, and I guess it first really lodged in my head with that cancer essay that kind of did me in. I wouldn't say there's a group. The closest thing I'm aware of is work that we are trying to convene and encourage around the WA 2.0 project, which we launched and assembled over the last couple of years, launched during the election campaign, which steps through the growth economy and why it's going to shatter everything, and then proposes effectively a model of closed-loop economics to replace it, which means you transition your economy across a piece at a time, not necessarily overnight. In fact, overnight would probably be a disaster and would hurt a lot of people, but you transition every element of your economy across until it's behaving like the biosphere. So at the moment, the lights are being powered by this frenzy of fossil fuel combustion, but actually we exist under this extraordinary abundance of sunlight falling free from the sky. So why don't we have industry powered more like a plant than a mine? And you can completely close that particular loop. You can just completely cut that out. The plastic bottle, you can make plastic like that out of cellulose now. And the only difference will be that in 3 months' time it will have completely disappeared, or else we could have used glass. Closed loop economics for me is the closest I've come across in my work to seeing a viable alternative. And you can kind of see where everything fits. I can see where bioplastics fit, industrial composting, organic farming, renewable energy. I can't, under any circumstances, fit plutonium or uranium mines into it. Some things you just have to design out. But nearly all of the work that we do in the broader green, small g green movement fits into that closed loop economy model.
What about jobs and things like that, because that's the big argument, isn't
Sure.
it? That there's not enough jobs created because this is a sustainable
Yeah, it's completely the opposite of that. When you actually run the numbers that industry produces, there are gas-fired power stations to the north of this city that have no employees at all. Rolling solar PV and energy efficiency across the building stock in the entire country is a big jobs generator. So is water efficiency, all the kind of food stuff that we need to do. That it comes through in this book somewhat, but actually the form of industrial capitalism that we're in the thrall of at the moment sheds employment. It's mechanising very rapidly. It's trying to throw people away. It's terrible for jobs. The mining industry is automating as fast as it can. They would prefer not to employ anybody at all. Anyway, Ask this guy a question.
I think the question's a really good one. I mean, in some of the areas in which I work of social policy, one of the realisations of a lot of people from the left is that the issue of economic policy has been neglected. We've been distracted by a lot of social issues which we need to pursue, but the economic policy issue is increasingly in the social policy field. People are saying we need to pursue that issue much more strategically and much more rigorously. So I think certainly Scott mentioned some of the environmental questions. Certainly from the social policy field, there's that recognition as well. But that's been poorly done. Yeah, so it's a really good question. Thank you. Anyone? Karun, you want to get the gentleman here?
Scott, you touched briefly on corporate speak, and the one thing that I've noticed over the past 3 years, the Tories and Conservatives are extremely good at is controlling the terms of the conversation that we have in the media, in the public eye. You've got them doing it again now at the moment with the demonisation of asylum seekers, where now they're being termed as illegal arrivals and detainees. It's something that the left doesn't do very well, and that's something that I've been mulling over for, again, the past 3 years, is how does the left take that back from the right and start? We get to determine the terms used in the conversation. And because if the last election showed anything, it's that the Greens can have all the policies in the world, the ALP can have all the policies in the world, but we still get a government elected that got in having 2 or 3 major public policies that were put out there. And I just think if we can't overcome that challenge of using, making the terms used in the conversation our own, we don't stand a chance of convincing the masses, the people who aren't here today, to vote the way we need them to vote. I guess what I'm looking for is any advice that either of you have on, especially from Anthony as a journalist who has to communicate with people so often. How do you getting people to use the term?
I think the important thing is that we call out bullshit, which is almost an obvious thing to say, but I think too often it's not done. I think too many journalists, and I don't have that many friends in the media for good reasons. I don't really like them very much. I like some of them are fine. But I think the problem here is that too many journalists need to be actually challenged on that. Don't underestimate the importance of not abusing journalists, but writing to them, trying to have an engaged conversation. Most journalists, despite what they say, don't actually like that much public engagement. This is younger and older. I mean, in theory, you could ask someone older who hasn't been used to a more interactive media. To me, the corporate press is still used to the from-on-God perspective, where a newspaper comes out and their word is gospel. And even those who are on Twitter, and many journalists now are, some engage in conversation, but many do not. Don't be afraid to engage in that. It's not going to change the entire system by simply having a Twitter conversation with person X. It won't. But in the broader sense, I think it's important that those views, like, say, illegal immigration, or a so-called war on terror, or what a terrorist is. I mean, that's something I've written a lot about over the years, about the way that too much of the media and politicians call anyone who's critical of Western foreign policy a terrorist. I mean, the idea somehow that an insurgent in Afghanistan who kills an Australian soldier is a terrorist, he's an insurgent. The Australian soldier is not a civilian, he's a soldier. And I'm not saying I feel comfortable with the grief that his family suffers, of course we don't. But the fact is that he's a soldier in war, that's what happens. But too often you wouldn't find that in the press at all. In fact, in so many of these cases, you say that the Americans have been fighting terrorists in Iraq. Well, if you're blowing up buses, you're a terrorist with civilians. If you're killing soldiers, you're not. And that sort of challenge, I think, needs to be said over and over again. Is it going to win the argument? I don't know, but at least it needs to be made. I think more journalists shouldn't be afraid of doing it, and the public, I think, would be maybe surprised how initially pissed off, but I think journalists or those in politics would be about that, but they need to be challenged, and I don't presume that they actually heard those arguments. Sometimes they live in a bubble. Mostly they live in a bubble.
Did you want to respond to that?
Humour and the internet. Some of the best examples I guess I've seen of unpacking stuff is done by cartoonists.
Yeah.
and pictures of cats. Like, you know, really simple stuff that is funny and propagates very rapidly. You know, Anthony says, calling out bullshit. Humour's a really clever way of doing it. Simple and sharp and graphic as possible. So that's my slightly senseless contribution to that.
You want to get just here, Karun, and we'll send Karun around.
Not really sure how this works. I'm Alexis, I'm from Socialist Alternative. I just wanted to thank, is it Antony or Anthony?
Anthony.
Oh, right. Hello? Yeah, I'd like to thank Antony for his talks both tonight and last night. I've had the benefit of listening to them both. Quite similar, but some differences, which is pleasant. But I think there's really a wealth of information in Antony's book that left-wing activists can use, you know, in our conversations and to make our arguments, which I think is great. In terms of what Scott finished on, I really agree that we can't be looking to Parliament in order to change things fundamentally, and we really do need fundamental change. But I think it has been a mistake on the left for too long to look to Parliament and to look to elections as the way to bring about change. And I think it was actually a mistake of the Greens to go into the coalition with Labor. I've been a left-wing activist for 10 years now. It's not a massive period of time, but you know, half that period of time has been under the Liberal government, half under Labor. And if we look at the balance sheet of the last 6 years, I think there's been very little, if any, progressive reforms. And then at the end of it, the Greens vote went down. So I think we really need to get back to grassroots politics and, you know, the politics of mass action, of you know, the trade unions not talking about boxing clever, but talking about going on strike and picketing like in you know, like in the 70s, like they're doing.
You got a question? Just, I'm happy for you to make a statement, but you can keep it brief and get to a question because we've got a lot of questions. Thanks.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I agreed with Scott, I think it was, in terms of, I think we're going to see a lot more struggles because we're going to see a lot more attacks from the Abbott government. So I think you know, in those struggles we need to be looking towards mobilising people, towards rank and file networks in our unions, you know, in our workplaces and communities, university campuses. So look forward to seeing people.
Ask your question.
Just something gets your question.
No, it was just a comment. You said. Look forward to seeing people in this.
It's okay. It's all right. Happy for you to make a statement.
I'll stop. Yeah, just wanted to say, look forward to seeing people here in the struggle.
Thank you. I've got one here that I was told I must ask, and some of you who know Jack Smith at Project Sapcom will know that when Jack calls and tells you to ask a question, you ask it. So this is from Jack, who was going to drive up from Narrogin. Those of you who know Jack know he lives in Narrogin, but he couldn't, he was sick. So he sent this question. He asked both Scott and Anthony to respond, and I had to write a word for word. Whenever Germaine Greer has an axe to grind against misogyny or against Tony Abbott, she's very comfortable and willing to address outrage in public. There are hundreds of Australian academics writing PhDs and doing research on asylum seekers and refugees, but they are largely silent. Jack's question is, where are the outraged academics?
This is an issue I've thought a lot about, and I have academic friends and some of them do amazingly wonderful work, including in this room, but there's a lot of thought that's gone into the argument that, and this has been going on for decades, so let's not ignore the fact that there have been a lot of useful idiots in the last decades over a lot of wars and a lot of situations. And there's a great classic essay from Chomsky in the 60s where he talks about the reality of academics and intellectuals in the US, many of whom initially at least did not oppose the Vietnam War. They were silent. Let's not forget the fact that there were a litany of intellectuals, so-called academics, post 9/11, who signed up with the Bush administration, not only literally, but said, what can we do to help? How can we assist your plan? How can we assist your war making? And in a local context, I think there's a few reasons. One, the university is obviously under attack. There are neoliberal policies, academics often frightened of speaking out. I know many academics who are not like that. There are, for example, Sydney University, some of you may be aware, the Centre of Peace and Conflict Studies is currently engaged in quite a high-profile battle. If you haven't read about it, you certainly will soon. In short, I'll give you the 15-second version. Jake Lynch and Stuart Rees, who are involved in those organisations, Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies, support BDS, boycott, divestment and sanction, against Israel for its crimes against the Palestinians. And they are being attempted to be sued in the federal court for alleged racism for engaging in BDS. And this is, was announced this week. It's going to be going to the federal court probably from next month. And rest assured, there will not be an army of academics coming out to support them. There will be a handful. There have been a handful, to their credit, but not many. And it's almost like the real test of not just academics, intellectuals in general, is the issue is actually where you pay a price for speaking out. It's easy to come out and support the consensus view. Coming out, I would argue, in this day and age, and saying climate change is real, I don't really think takes much risk. Scott might disagree with me about that, but some people say it's not real. I do know that, and there's pressure on those who say that. But it's not, you're not going to seriously face massive condemnation, probably. Coming out and saying certain things about asylum seekers or Israel-Palestine or other issues is a risk. It's a risk in the context of your job security, it's an issue in the context of your colleagues and friends. And I've got a lot of academics who do speak out, but I think many of them don't for a combination of fear and also gutlessness. And I think there's nothing wrong with saying, as I say towards journalists, that we should say equally towards academics and those in intellectual pursuits. You have a responsibility morally to speak out when things are not going right. Morally. And sadly, it's almost like, inherent in Jack's question is, and this is my criticism of him and always to say, why do we presume academics or intellectuals would speak out on any issue? Why would you presume that, where are the plumbers speaking out about asylum seekers? I say that flippantly, but I say that also seriously. Why do we make the presumption that it has to be intellectuals who speak out? There's no reason why people from all backgrounds should be speaking out about whatever interests them. The thing is, where's the megaphone for them to do so? And at the moment, unfortunately, too often academics are using the platform of not speaking out. One only has to read, some of you may know The Conversation, which is a website started a while ago. Now, if you read through that and don't fall asleep, good luck. I think maybe that's being a little unfair, but there's a lot of articles in there which almost proudly are sitting on the fence. There's a really massive poll up a lot of academics' asses. That's exactly the same about journalists as well. So many academics I know, I'm going to finish on this subtle point, so many academics I know actually are very happy with the position that they have. And non-academics resent engaging on issues with the general public. They may teach students, of course they do, but I'm saying with the so-called great unwashed amongst us, many of them don't like that engagement. And that is a fundamental problem. And a lot of young academics who are coming up need to be told by their elders that is simply not acceptable in the 21st century.
I'm upset.
No, I'm not going to try and out-militant that though, because that would be tough act to follow. So I would say two things. Firstly, be aware that the universities have had the crap kicked out of them in the last 15 or 20 years. They've all been seriously corporatised and forced to run like businesses. They're shedding staff. The student guilds were attacked, end of 2005. Haven't really recovered in my view. There has been a systematic and moderately successful attempt to depoliticise universities and terrify the faculty. Having said that, in defence of academics, the academics who I have the most contact with in my work are people working in city policy and energy policy who kick ass. If you've ever come across Professor Peter Newman, for example, he's out there, he's a troublemaker, he's teaching his students to be troublemakers. And there are a few out there, and I guess it makes the others even more notable by their absence, but the ones who do go a little bit further, get off the fence and go out and advocate using the platform that they're given and that their students are given are all the more valuable for that. So it's not completely all crap.
Come up there with the microphone and then we'll come down to Joe and then you go, Alex. So
So,
You got it.
my question is in reference to what Scott was saying about terms of government and I guess Labor's performance or downfall the past couple of elections and how the party's changing. And it might inspire the ire of some of the people in the room by me asking this, which is great.
Good on you.
And I ask both of you. I'm wondering if the union movement is losing its political relevance to the Australian public and its political collateral for the Labor Party, and you know, whether it's of use in campaigning and that sort of stuff. And I mean, it's kind of a really big question. It's both for the Labor Party's performance, but also, you know, in political campaigning in general, because I know a lot of people are fairly middle class and don't feel very involved in the union movement. Anyway, I throw it to the floor.
Thank you. Good question.
I'll just say a few words about that. I mean, I think that it's a problem that Labor's identity is so tightly connected to the union movement. I think the idea in the 21st century that the Labor Party sees itself as so connected to the unions when so many unions don't represent their workers is a problem. And you have the most prominent unionist in the country, Paul Howes, who proudly writes columns for the Financial Review talking about how privatisation is the future for the Labor Party. That's a problem. There are, having said that, wonderful union leaders, many of whom I know who do incredibly invaluable work. Of course that's true. But I think there is an issue with representation by the union movement, there's no doubt about that. There are a lot of reasons for that, as Scott would rightly say, I'm sure. They've had the shit kicked out of them for years by various governments, including Labor, I might add. And when you have a union leader who says, this is where it needs to be challenged, let's glorify the wonderful so-called reforms of Hawke and Keating, what exactly does that mean? The so-called reforms of Hawke and Keating actually were not good for workers, FYI, they were the opposite. And that's actually what Labor has now says is its wonderful legacy. So to me, unless Labor chooses to have an identity amongst itself and work out what it stands for, which I'm not convinced it will at all, which is why I said to Scott before, though maybe or to all of you, but it was directed partly to Scott, that the idea somehow that it'd be healthy if Labor stays out of power indefinitely. That's not to say, yay, Tony Abbott for the next 20 years. That's not what it means. It simply means that Labor actually has such a fundamental crisis of conscience amongst itself that the only way, and this is a theory I guess about a party losing so badly as it did in New South Wales. In New South Wales where I live, Labor lost abominably. Do you think there's been serious major reform about that party? Nope. A little bit to its credit, not much. And Labor didn't lose as badly in this federal election as they thought that they would. It wasn't a great loss or win, depends how you want to see it. But they weren't crushed, put it that way. Until we actually recognise that the connection between the most conservative unions and Labor is part of the problem here in crushing its ability to see beyond the so-called privatisation agenda. Labor needs to be told that over and over and over again. I'm not saying I'm the one to do it, but I think a lot of people out there can say that. If Labor sees itself as a party of workers, which it still claims to be, and its new leader, Billy Shorten, says that constantly, you have to ask ourselves what that actual legacy of the workers' movement is. It's not the Labor Party anymore, that's for sure, at all.
Scott, what do you want to do?
Not a huge amount to add. I thought that was actually really elegantly expressed. The union movement itself is facing a degree of crisis of identity, as the workforce, as everybody knows in here, has been heavily casualised. The unions, we're being told in the newspapers every day, have lost their relevance, there's no further purpose for them. I think that has occluded the extraordinarily valuable kind of grassroots day-to-day work that is done representing people who have joined the union and those who haven't joined it and yet still are afforded the measure of protection by them being there. But the association with the Labor Party in recent years just hasn't been a happy one. They're coming, a lot of them are coming, I shouldn't say a lot, a significant number, significant to us anyway, are coming across to the Greens. I think what the NTEU just did was, I think, is highly significant. We've not seen, apart from occasional kind of footsie by the MUA or the ETU over the last 10 years, what the NTEU just did over the uni cards was actually pretty bold. Cost them a little bit internally as well. It was a bit divisive. Ultimately, for I guess you've always been through this, they spent more than $1 million on the campaigning against the uni cuts for their members and for students and they were saying vote green on the material. And that, I suspect, might not be the last time that occurs. But, you know, we're still dealing, I think, with a movement that needs to do its own reinvention and, you know, particularly reach out to casualised workers or people who aren't in these sort of organised factory kind of structures that the movement grew out of. Briefly, if I can just go back, I forget, sir, it might have been you, but it wasn't a question, it was a statement, but it would have been a good question if you'd asked it. Sorry, I'm not having a go, but the whole Greens being a coalition with the Labor Party, and that was a bad idea. We're not here to grandstand. The way Christine kind of puts it is you're in opposition, you win capital, you're in government or you're able to share a measure of government, you spend that capital and you get shit done. I am of the view that the carbon price instrument, which is why I'm going to fight like hell to protect it, was actually pulling CO2 out of the air and getting stuff built. That's why we're there, not to put out press statements. We're actually there to get stuff done. And yet, then we suffered a backlash, like a very significant attack. And so did the Labor Party. And I figured we were a bit hamstrung because they never jumped up and defended stuff that they did that was pretty good. On the stuff on that, I've spent the last 5 years fighting them tooth and nail over marketing of radioactive waste dump in the Northern Territory. We weren't actually in coalition. We said we won't block supply, we won't crash the government in no confidence unless you turn out to be really corrupt. But we will vote with you on things we agree with, we'll amend what we can, we will fight like hell on stuff we disagree with. And I actually don't regret that. Otherwise, what do you want us in there for? You know, I could join Friends of the Earth and do NVA or put out press statements or do movement building. No, I'm not. I love Friends of the Earth. But I'm saying you elect the Greens and independents and other progressives or, you know, Sam, if we can get him elected one day, to influence legislatures. And that means fucking doing it. It means doing deals, it means trading, it means negotiating. Otherwise, you know, probably we shouldn't bother. I think it is worth it.
Any former parliamentarians, Joe?
Well, let's bother, and let's bother. Let's get very bothered. I don't think I need this. I want to just link together a couple of the things that have been asked. Great discussion. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Caroline, wherever you are here, bringing Anthony over. This is just fantastic. And Colin, thank you. The question about the growth economy. One of the most exciting ways that people can get involved, and this is not just for people who've got lots of money, anybody who's got a bank account at all, look at 350.org. They are running a divestment campaign, and Scott can probably tell you a bit more about that. Explain to us what is a stranded asset. Fantastic. Keep the fossil fuels in the ground. We can't afford to have them all dug up and putting carbon into the atmosphere. But we have power. We have power. And it was done with the ANZ Bank just last week. I think it's this weekend, the Commonwealth Bank. Masses of people taking their money out of those banks. If you bank with any of the 4 big banks, you're contributing to fossil fuels harming our atmosphere. So we can take a lot of power by getting involved in that way with the divestment campaign. So you might like to say a bit more about 350.org, Scott, or Anthony.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks heaps. The irony is if you're here, you're not actually at the divestment forum. You had to mention, well, where's everybody else? So you could have done both. So this is work that's coming out of 350.org, which Bill McKibben is kind of the spokesperson for, and he was in Australia a couple of months ago. And it's based on mathematics of under no circumstances can we cross that 2-degree temperature threshold. We are already experiencing dangerous climate change. The weirdness and the violence that is around us at the moment has been cooked up with 1 degree. The scientists are saying you go further than 2 degrees, it's just kind of starts talking about the end of civilization. So let's not do that. So then you do the mathematics and you work backwards, and it basically says 80% of the planet's known fossil fuel reserves and estimated fossil fuel reserves have to stay underground no matter what. 80%. And Australia is a very large exporter. We're the world's largest exporter of coal. We're trying hard to be the world's largest exporter of gas. And that means for us in this town, picking a very serious fight with serious people like Woodside, and Chevron. We know we can win these because we just did on the Kimberley Coast. But the way to really go after them, as well as putting ourselves in the way of blocking roads when it comes to that, is pull the damn money out. This is capitalism, right? Really, mostly what it cares about is money. And our superannuation, pension funds, universities, all the places, there's more, well over $1 trillion in superannuation funds from Australians there that needs to be there for your retirement, and ideally your retirement needs to be on a planet that doesn't resemble Venus. So the idea is that we go after things like the Future Fund, superannuation funds, wherever the universities have their money parked, and the big four banks, and pull it out. Not right across the board. I think the way that they're thinking is, who can we pick? Who's a good win? Who can we go after? Who can we terrify and make an example of? And then put them at the top of the list of people who divested, and then work our way down through the list. It's a global movement, and I'm glad you brought it up, Joe, because I think it's the single most exciting thing going on in climate campaigning at the moment.
One of the things we've got down here is a list of all of the, not all, because we probably missed some of the major campaigns around Perth. Now the 350 divestment is on that. So there's a handout there that you can take at the end that will give you a lot of the campaigns people have spoken about tonight, including that one. Thank you.
I just want to add something to what Scott said. One of the reasons that, divestment is having such success, and 50-50 being one of them, and there are other groups as well, but they're the most high profile. Oxford University released a report a few weeks ago, the Guardian report, that you guys could Google it, which said that in fact the fossil fuel companies are recognising how powerful and worrying this is from their perspective. And how this is actually working in a very practical sense. Let's give one very quick example. Across the US, what 350 has been doing is having lots of public forums, often at universities, forming groups at universities to therefore try to convince in various different ways universities to not invest in fossil fuel companies. It's fairly simple. Sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. But my point is that this is getting actually a great deal of groundswell of support, and it's having an effect. And the New York Times puts it on the front page, and it's written in the context of a fossil fuel company executive saying, how dare they try to challenge it, we're being warmed to Americans. Well, you are being warmed to Americans, yes. I mean, that's one way to look at it. That's very nice that they're keeping people warm at night, but the issue is a little bit different to that. So I agree. I think divestment is also important, just as an aside, in relation to BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, deal with Israel and Palestine. And there's a growing movement of that, which so far in Australia has had medium to little media coverage, but there's certainly overseas a growing university campaign as well, which is saying to universities, you should not support or invest corporations that are operating in the occupied West Bank of Palestine. And the successes are different, but I think those successes are going to grow as Israel continues to behave as it does.
My name's Alex. I'm with the Socialist Alliance, and in the spirit of dialogue, I've basically got a very sort of brief three-point response to the things that Scott said earlier, and I'll invite a response from Scott. The first thing was that Scott said about the whole operation of the Murdoch media during the election campaign being a sign of the media and democracy being broken. And to me, I would have thought it's actually more the other way around. It's actually, the operation of the Murdoch media in the election campaign was exactly how the corporate media is designed to work in a corporate system. And actually that sort of implies not that we've got Ludlam is broken, but it actually points out that we actually need to have an alternative to the status quo. The second point is about, Scott's reference to in 2007, the sort of environment movement kind of went dead. Now, part of the fact it's not really very ego-flattering for those of us that didn't go to sleep. I don't think it's actually quite strictly in accord with the facts either. And the first thing I'd say is, the walk against warming, the very first walk against warming was admittedly in 2007, but it was after that election. The other walk against warmings, probably the biggest, I think the first one was the biggest, but nevertheless there were substantial mobilisations in 2008 and later years. And then especially in 2009, when the climate summit was held, there was a big injection of the enthusiasm around the idea of 100% renewables in 10 years came out of that climate summit. That was in the process of Beyond Zero Emissions launching that kind of project as well. I feel like there was a lot of enthusiasm around that time, and I actually think that. So I think it's after 2009 that the climate movement has suffered its decline, not from 2007. And I know this isn't flattering to you, but I actually would put it back the other way around. I think the thing that changed then was that the Greens, whereas they had been oppositional to the Labor government's CPRS, came to support a carbon price policy which had some sweetness compared to the CPRS, but fundamentally had, the same. Well, certainly, as I understand it, the three amendments that the Greens put up to the CPRS, which were the bottom line things that have to change in order for the Greens to support the CPRS, which was a measly sort of 5% target, the fact of big corporate subsidies to the compensation, and thirdly the fact of international offsets being part of the CPRS. All of those things were the bottom line to the Greens in 2009, but all those things are part of the carbon price that we've got under sort of the GI government. So I think that the Greens' support for that government policy is a big factor in the decline in the grassroots climate movement. Obviously, obviously these things are in interaction, but I guess I would sort of invite that response to you. But I think also that, in terms of what you said just in answer to the previous question about that carbon price bringing emissions down, I think that's actually not also an important facts. I mean, it's true emissions have come down, but it's not because of the carbon price. I mean, I don't have time to sort of detail the analysis of that, but the closure of the Curry aluminium smelter in New South Wales, other things like that were the renewable energy target, things that were not a result of the carbon price, but I think those things have got, are more directly responsible for what reduction in emissions has come down. So that leads to me to my third point and final, just briefly. I think there's I think there is an advantage of, there is something to be gained in this sort of which way forward to the left, in actually listening to, taking on board, including the socialist revolutionary left as part of the discussion. And I actually think that ideally what we want, if we want to actually have a real and genuine sort of moving forward to the left, is actually a synthesis of some of the strengths of both the Greens and the socialist revolutionary left. I think if we're talking about a genuine way forward to the left, I can't see an alternative to that. And I know obviously the socialist left is very small in terms of our numbers, in terms of the vote we can get in elections, all those things, that's undeniable. But I think there are strengths that we do bring to the table, and that we need to have a synthesis of both of those strengths if we are going to move forward. So that's my three comments, and I'll leave my response.
Thanks, Alex. Scott, anything you want to respond to parts of that?
Going into too much detail since it's always good use of our guests' time, that's all. Because that's probably a good conversation for over a beer. On the first, I think I'll probably just agree and just concede, maybe my own just a little bit sloppy, around that interplay between media and politics and that kind of feedback loop. I think that's how you express it's basically reasonable. On the second, I guess I strongly disagree. There by no means was the Clean Energy Act perfect, and there are compromises in there. At the point where we basically had to say we either get this or we're not going to get anything at all. The issue of offsets, the issue of the target, I mean today, that what they call Climate Change Authority came out with a thing that said 5% is pathetic, won't cut it, it needs to be 25%. Right as they're facing down abolition and a hostile Prime Minister, nonetheless, that agency was set up independently to do exactly what it's done, which was whack that whole 5% thing out of the park, and that's what it's done. I'm sorry that we weren't able to protect it to the degree that if those bills go through, it'll disappear and won't be heard from again. But hell, maybe we could crowdfund that thing as well, like we do with the Climate Commission. So that's on targets. And the fact is, it has the existence of that price and the literally millions of dollars that it is transferring from heavy polluters across to the other places that that money has gone, has changed the structure of the electricity market. Maybe not as much here in WA as we would have liked, but you can't deny that whacking $6 million off Clive Palmer, which you will contest in the courts, and raising billions of dollars, it tilts the table. The idea was that that price would continue to go up. We would have, I guess, a fascinating argument about whether the trading is a good idea or not. But the fact is you can't drag billions with a B out of polluting industries and transfer them into clean technology without that having an impact on your emissions profile. And the CPRS wouldn't have done that. It was designed not to do that. We voted against it, I'm glad that we did. I'm glad that we voted for the package that we've got. I'm going to fight like a wild animal to protect it and make sure that it's still there. On the third one, I will need beer. I think the Greens need to do some soul searching post the election, whether that be around sharpness of the message or direction, or why the general population wasn't, how how the general population of the country ended up more concerned about a carbon tax than about the fact that we turned the weather against us. And the socialist crew need to ask themselves why they are still so little. Why they've been so little for a really long time. Like what? We both, I think it is a good conversation to have. We've both got to address that. And I mean that genuinely when I say, you know, everybody in this room, whether you're in politics or out of it, if we're not learning from each other over the next couple of years, we're going to get squashed.
Anthony, you've written about this issue of the Greens. Do you want to throw your 20 cents in, or the links with the Socialist Alliance to the Greens? Do you want to, I mean, you're a commentator on these issues.
Look, I might even use my privilege here holding the mic. Chris Hedges, and I find this year, I'm thinking of any of the other mark, but if you can address it here. Chris Hedges did a very powerful presentation to the Greens, I think it was earlier this year, where he was really strongly encouraging the Greens to, in America, to be getting much more involved in grassroots campaigns. And I think probably the Greens here probably, you know, I don't know 100%, but I imagine that the Greens here have got a better track record about that. We didn't see Greens getting stronger behind the Occupy movement, for example. Comments on that?
You go first.
I can't comment obviously about that last particular bit. I hadn't heard that was the case. I think the Greens are having or they should be having an existential crisis. It doesn't mean they can't get over it. But there's an issue here, and this I think is something that a lot of third parties have around the world, and it's not unique to Australia. You see across Europe a lot of Green parties who have struggled when they're in, call it what you want, coalition, association, partnership with a major party. Germany being the best example, and the situation there is complex. I won't bore you with the details, but there's no doubt that the Greens certainly suffered electorally from being perceived to be, well not perceived, they were too close to a leading party. There's some explanations why that was, that climate change sort of went from being a so-called fringe issue to a so-called mainstream issue. But I think in Australia there's been a tendency, and I'm not a member of the Greens, I have associations with Greens people, but I'm not an official member or anything, just to put that on the record. But I certainly think that in the last 3 years, since there was a partnership with Labor, that a lot of issues, and the Greens often became far too hesitant, far too cautious, far too lacking in spine on certain issues, and I think climate change, ironically, is one of them. I think Israel-Palestine is certainly one of them. I think certain foreign affairs issues are part of it. And the Greens can't be everything to everybody. No party ever can be. And the reasons, I think, unless, and I agree with Scott, if there is a serious analysis within the party, which is what the party has to do and its members, to understand why the support for the Greens went down so much. If that analysis and discussion happens, that's good. If it doesn't, it's a problem. And I'll just say one last point. There's no doubt, and I speak more about New South Wales here in Victoria, I can't speak so much for WA, I don't know so much about this state in relation to this issue, but there's certainly a massive gap in the Greens reaching out grassroots to communities who are not principally white. And I think there's no doubt that in certain ethnic communities, refugee communities, of course the Greens do some important work on refugees, of course they do, and I admire that deeply. But there's no doubt in many parts of, say, out of Sydney and Victoria and elsewhere, there is I want to say a lot of people will be listening to that message who are not getting it. Now the Greens are a small party, they haven't got the same infrastructure as Labor and Liberal, I get that. But it's almost an untapped market, for want of a better expression. And I know there are certain people in New South Wales, Lee Rhiannon, who's a colleague of Scott and a friend of mine, who wants to do that a lot more. It's easier said than done, but that to me is a vital issue. The criticism the Greens often receive in the corporate press is not entirely untrue. It can't simply be, or principally be, in my view, and this is a personal view, an inner city party. If you want to grow, you can't simply be, or principally be, a party which is for mostly an inner city area. You can be, but you're not going to get past 10, 12, 13%. You won't. And there's no doubt in the last few years the growing connection between, say, on CSG, coal seam gas, and the Greens, I think, are important. How that's played out electorally, I don't know. I mean, I know that there was an election a few months ago. I don't think it was as successful thus far as one would have liked. But I think there are a lot of areas where the Greens, I think, could, if they chose to, become a far more effective advocate. But also say, it's whether the Greens want to be a bigger player or a shit stirrer throwing shit from the outside in. And that's maybe what a third party has to come to terms with. That's a choice they will have to make, and that's made, I guess, by its members, by its senators, etc. I have my own views about that, but I suspect Scott and I disagree about that, which is great and fine. But I think that's an issue the Greens need to deal with much more publicly in my view than they have so far.
I don't know, is this interesting for people?
Yeah.
Not that in particular. That's not the forum that it was advertised that we were going to, that's all. And I think probably it will get a bit boring if I just keep going through rebutting things point by point. I'm not reaching out to communities of colour. I just think guilty. I'm not even going to contest that. I think that's true. And it's something that we are working on and actually trying to do better at. But probably hesitate to fess up on some of the other stuff. And also keep in mind, and I hope you'll take this in the spirit in which it's intended, not so much that us and them, and that you Greens should do more of this and you Greens should be more like that. We are the political or the parliamentary wing of civil society groups. You know, the basic shape of it, I guess, is that the Liberal Party originally just represent the blue bloods and big business. The Labor Party was the parliamentary expression of the Labor movement, and the Greens came through feminist movements of the late 1970s, the anti-war movement, anti-nuclear weapons, forests, anti-mining, Aboriginal land rights, and so on. We're the parliamentary expression of the civil society and advocates and activist groups. And that's where we've come from. Which means if you think we should change form or create links or be more strategic, and I've heard tonight that we should, be bigger and more mainstream and also be more and more shit-stirring and throwing rocks. There are tensions within the party and outside, because it's hard to do both of those things at the same time. I came through a direct action background, but also wear a suit for a living, and schmooze big American solar energy companies, because I think they're a part of the solution as well. Kind of hard to maintain that tension and do both. But if you think we can do better, we are actually quite an open organisation. Any Greens member can come to any meeting. Join in, give us a hand. If you think we can do it better, seriously, give us a hand. We are moderately outnumbered. I think we've been around for 20 or 30 years, and I actually don't buy into some of the catastrophism that's been written about the 2013 election result, because it's on trend, roughly. Why is it doing that? For how we've been going since 1990. There was a spike in 2010 for various reasons that would be interesting to go into again over a beer. And what's happened, we polled better here in Western Australia 2 months ago than I did in 2007. So we haven't gone off the cliff, people. I'm not saying that it's all great. We lost 2 very good state MPs in March and had shit kicked out of us. And our vote has gone backwards since 2010. But we haven't gone off the cliff. And seriously, if you think you can do it, if you think you can help us move it along, join in, show up at meetings and have opinions, because that's how I've been involved.
Oh, sorry.
Did that come across as defensive? No.
Perhaps moving on from individual party politics, but looking more at the broader movements. I think in your journalism you're able to eloquently stitch together the different campaigns across social justice and environmental campaigns. What are your thoughts around how we stitch together and link together those movements to have a more coherent kind of campaign for a better world, rather than somewhat siloed, disparate, sporadic series of groups, albeit on a spreadsheet?
I guess I preface any answer with I have no set answer. It's a difficult question. Certainly on certain campaigns that I've been involved with, yes, I'm a journalist, but I'm also not afraid to say I'm an activist on a lot of issues. And when it comes to the issue, for example, of Israel-Palestine, which is not the only issue in the world, but it's an important one, but I think there's too often too little communication and discussion between a generally more mainstream white community and very little interaction with an Arab-Palestinian community. There's lots of reasons for that. I don't think it's based on racism, nothing like that. I think it's just based on a sense that a lot of Arabs in the Arab community and Palestinians don't want to get involved or don't want to get involved on those terms. It's a complex issue. I think those kind of connections need to be made much more than they are. When it comes to the issue of, for example, aid, the ethics and the politics of aid, which is a massive issue. I think a lot of NGOs need to be far more open to having a conversation about the lack of transparency in their own organisations. I've done a lot of talks in the last few months for this book, and including with certain aid organisations. They're public events, so it's recorded and open for anyone. And it'd be fair to say a lot of defensiveness going on. I'm not saying NGOs are evil and the devil, not at all. They do some good, wonderful work, but if NGOs are getting a lot of our money and time and energy, and they're doing work in various countries, including here in our own, there needs to be a sense of what are the metrics of success or failure, and too often that is exactly not being done. What is also the role of corporatised aid, and that's also an issue. So I'm talking about these issues and other ones as well, and welcome. There are many others, and I guess how do you de-solarize these issues? I mean, it's not even a word, but it should be. It's a really good one. I think there needs to be a lot more. I think it's a question of simply saying more coordination. It's sort of obvious I'm trying to say. I think there needs to be a lot. I'm very much a believer, and a lot of my work hopefully shows that in the sort of activism I do in crossing racial boundaries, and that happens very too rarely. One of the things about James Price Point that I wrote about, and a lot of the groups who are involved up there, and this is your state, so you guys probably know more about it than I do, is that it's not that common to have Indigenous groups and white environmental groups working together. Of course it happens, it does happen. But one of the things also within often groups who are campaigning for or against James Price Point had Indigenous and white groups, individuals within them, and that's not exactly in my view revolutionary, but the groups up there were saying to me, and as well in the city, this has not happened very often. And I think that's the problem. And again, I have no expert opinion how to fix all that, but there's so many issues that affect Indigenous communities and white communities that affect us both. Frankly, it affects them much more than it affects me as a white person. It affects me morally and spiritually rather than practically. I live in a city like probably most of us do here. That to me is a big issue, and I think it should be discussed. I think a lot of environmental groups, from my understanding, don't often enough engage with Indigenous groups as much as they should. That's my experience and what they tell me themselves. Scott?
I feel like it's something that we are getting a little bit better at. James Price Point was an interesting example, but also that was tremendously divisive in that town, in Broome, because you had traditional owners from up the coast who signed on, who figured for the first time in their experience they might actually be able to get some money out of a resource company. And you had people from further up the coast saying you can't put that thing on that country. So it actually was quite divisive, but it also, for me, and I spent a fair bit of time up at camp during the course of that blockade over a period of 2 years. When you were there, when you were on country, Philip or any of the old people who would come through camp ran that place. And it was one of the strongest appreciations, I guess, of sovereignty that I've ever come across. You were on their country and it was their rules, and if they didn't want you there, you were off. The other example, which is also very close to my heart, is the anti-uranium campaign here in Western Australia is being strongly led by Aboriginal goldfielders and people from sort of between Maluma and Cal. And again, when you're up on their country, it's their campaign and they are providing that leadership, which is extraordinarily powerful. Wasn't the case either in my earlier experience coming into the movement so much in WA. My first experience of that, I guess, was at Jabaluka, where again they gave you a passport when you came onto country, and if you broke the rules, they'd kick you out of camp. And I think we could get much better at that in the city, linking arms here with Noongar mob about working out how to bring sustainability that much closer to home.
Listen, thank you for that very significant question, because in a sense that was one of the motivations for a number of us who talked about the city, that I think a lot of us had exactly the same feeling, and that we hope. I think, as Scott said, certainly some of that's already beginning, certainly here in the city and other campaigns, but you're exactly right, we need to get much better at it. So it's a fantastic question, and it was part of the genesis for this evening. Thank you. Where are we, Karun? Yep.
I think it was an interesting question about, how do we make this a better world? Well, for starters, how we make this a better world, we treat each other with respect. Now, the people up in front of you, they're obviously educated, they know what they're talking about, but that doesn't mean this young bloke over here doesn't know what he's talking about either. If people come here, let them have a say, because that's an important thing. Okay? It's important for everyone so they can have a say, because if you want this movement to go ahead, then we have to treat each other with respect, because that's how you're going to get people on board. Because without that, all this movement doesn't mean anything.
Up the back there, Curtin. Gentleman up the back there.
Testing you. Just a question to Scott. I read on the internet recently a proposal by the Abbott government to link in the, well, let's just say they're going to get rid of Centrelink and have the postal service take over those services. Now, how likely, this is a real question, how likely do you think the Abbott government will be that stupid?
I honestly don't know, and I haven't dug deep into that. And it also appears that there are a couple of proposals that came forward at the same time that haven't been through cabinet, that have just looked like these brain snaps that let them go to see into the public domain. You know, how many of them draw fire, how many of them don't appear to upset anybody too much. So the stuff around the ABC, privatising Australia Post, then having Australia Post be the kind of front office, I think also for national disability insurance and maybe Centrelink. But it's not stuff that I've dug into, but I don't think we should necessarily qualify these people as stupid. I'm not sure that they're stupid. If they were stupid, the next 3 years would probably be easier than they're going to be. There's some real calculation going on behind some of the stuff that they're doing, and again, not to keep bringing us back to the book, but that profit motive of industry always being just one step just behind over their shoulder, saying we could do that more efficiently. We could take Australia Post off your hands. You know, we could do that better. We could employ less people, provide a better service. Governments shouldn't be into that kind of service delivery anymore. That's old stuff. It's not stupidity driving that agenda. It's something different. The government will pick a lot of fights in the next couple of years, and that maybe that will be one of them. I don't know. And again, as I said right at the outset, we've got to make sure that we keep very closely in mind that these are all linked. They're all kind of the same thing. That's why this sort of work's really valuable. And I don't know how you folk feel, but who, when you came into the room this evening, looked around the room and saw a bunch of people that you already knew? Yeah? That's a really good thing. Perth is just the right size. We've got a good community here of people where there's folk here probably, if we did a poll and did a show of hands, from 20 or 30 different movements and groups and schools of thought, that we can all come in here. All I guess I would ask is see if you can meet one or two people tonight that you hadn't already met. But we're in a really good position here in ways that people in some of the big cities on the East Coast, these sort of things don't happen. Sorry, I really digressed, didn't I? I don't know if they're going to do us over on Centrelink or not. Sorry.
I just wanted to say something briefly, which is a bit different and not in fact related to the question, but it just made me think about this in terms of language and how I think often the left has made a mistake dealing with the asylum seeker issue. Just briefly, too often you hear, and all of us have heard this, and then we've said it ourselves, that Australians are racist. That we're racist, and we're racist, and the reason we're racist is that we're voting for Tony Abbott and we support appallingly racist policies for asylum seekers. I don't mean we in this room, but the Australian population. And there is racism in Australia against asylum seekers and Indigenous Australians and people of ethnic background. I'm not doubting any of that. But to me, I think it's a fundamental mistake to say politically and also practically that Australians are racist for no reason, or there's actually this massive racism in a vacuum, in a bubble. Where does that intolerance come from? It doesn't come out of nowhere. People aren't born racist. People aren't born to hate someone from Afghanistan or anywhere else. And to me, I think often, I see this after the Abbott government won a few months ago, that I see many on the left routinely saying, well, Australians are racist and you can't do much about it. And I would, and maybe the room doesn't agree with this, and that's totally fine, I think that's a mistake. I think it's a mistake to say that the majority of people who are not us are racist. If you go into a conversation to say you're all racist, as in the general public, how are you going to change people's minds? How are you actually going to convince them that asylum seekers are not terrorists and there's reasons why they should be treated humanely? I think it's an error strategically, and the left does this across the world. Many on the left do this, and I think it's a fundamental error to say that racism answers every question. When you realise why people have dislike of asylum seekers, when every single day for literally 15 years in the tabloid press, and most of us maybe, I do read it for work, every day tabloid press and tabloid radio and newspapers will say that asylum seekers are terrorists or they're a threat. Every day. It's going to have an effect. It has had an effect. It doesn't therefore mean people necessarily are racist. This is not to excuse actual racism or to say people have not got racist views. But I think it's far more complex than that, and we should actually, in my view, go into this argument by saying, how do we change people's minds rather than presuming everyone who's not as informed as us is racist?
Thanks for your time, guys. A quick question. What gives you hope and why?
Great question. What gives me hope, I suppose, is that we're all still here, that we haven't been beaten, that there appears to be an undercurrent where you take 2 steps back but you take 3 steps forward. You know, we live in a city where clean drinking water comes out of the tap and food is reasonably safe to eat. And, you know, we can have a room full of dissidents here having dangerous ideas, and it's reasonably likely that no one is going to kick your door down at 3 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes maybe good to step back and acknowledge the base that we're starting from, and then look at the opportunities that we have in front of us. This might be a bit unorthodox. Are there a few folk in the room who have been at the 350 Forum tonight? Oh, okay, good. I'm going to invite someone who can be self-selected down after Anthony's spoken to give us an update as to what happened at that meeting, because that gives me hope. That is the best thing I've seen going on around the world and in this country in the last little while on climate change, which is the big one, like it really does. So maybe we could see who wants to give us a bit of it. Is that right? Good suggestion. Okay. Oh, hey, this gives me hope that there'll be 2,000 people at this. This might be a good time to give a plug. 17 November, National Day of Climate Action. It's good that we don't have these too often, because the last thing you want to do with that demonstration is demonstrate that only 20 people care. This could be really large. This is in a couple of weeks' time. It's happening right around the country. Get Up is behind it. They've got a big mailing list. We're getting behind it. Everybody, please get behind it. That would give me hope if we just had so many people that even the cops had to admit there were more than 1,000.
I might just take up Anthony's, Scott's point, because we did want to provide an opportunity for anyone who wanted to offer their current events. So, Piers, do you want to say a brief bit about investment in 350?
He's obviously going to. Try and stop him.
Thanks, and thanks, Scott, for the opportunity. Yeah, we've just come from a really exciting... Piers Verstagen from Conservation Council.
Great arm, Piers.
It's very cloud up for us. From Conservation Council. It's really exciting to come from a forum that was in the Unions building, actually, just down the road, and there was even more people there, looking at what we can actually do to solve the climate crisis ourselves. And we've got a Prime Minister who's been elected telling us that we need to take direct action. So this is one of the ways of taking direct action. And what we're dealing with is, at the moment, some pretty startling figures. I think it was something like 30% of the total invested capital in the world is actually invested in fossil fuel companies, or has exposure to fossil fuel companies. So what this is about is saying these companies are destroying our climate, they're destroying our planet, and one person at a time, $1 at a time, one institution at a time, we're going to destroy their business model. And we're going to do that. By pulling out our investments out of our superannuation that we have, which is invested in fossil fuel companies, and Australian Ethical, by the way, is the only superannuation provider that doesn't invest in coal and gas fracking. So pulling our money out of our superannuation companies that are invested in those industries, pulling money out of banks that are invested in those industries, but more importantly, convincing the institutions that we work for and that we're part of, the civil society organisations, to also do the same. And so that's where that momentum can start. And as Carmen Lawrence said, who was one of the speakers, we can really strip away the social licence to operate that these companies have. So I won't take up any more time other than to say it's a really exciting direction that we can take direct action ourselves and not have to rely on the other government to deliver a measly 5% emissions reduction target. Thanks.
I just wanted to briefly answer that gentleman's question about what gives me hope. One of the things, I guess, and this is taking into a different area I've already discussed tonight, and I'll be brief, is in the last 5 years there have been, I think, 3 individuals who have changed the course of history in many ways. That's Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, and Edward Snowden. And how that's all going to play out, we don't know. History is long, the story is far from all told. The information that those 3 individuals, and many others, Thomas Drake in the US, there's a range of other whistleblowers, and I guess you'd say quasi-journalists who have done this kind of work, is to show us a world that we may have thought existed but didn't actually know. The evidence is there, we know. Although often in Australia we get a sense that it's almost going to take a revolution to actually get people to realise that, for example, there's mass surveillance occurring today as we speak. In the US and the UK there is now a very healthy, robust debate about what this actually means for society, why governments haven't got the right to tap all our phones and monitor everything that we say and write on Facebook. This is an important conversation that is actually happening at the moment. It's happened because one individual, or 1 or 2 individuals actually made a difference. The idea we regularly feel, what can we do on our own? And yes, most of us probably don't work for an NSA contractor. That's true. Maybe some of us do. If you work for Pine Gap, speak to me afterwards. But I think there is a realisation for me that one individual can make that difference, and that to me is incredibly inspiring.
Hi, Antony. This is actually turned out to be a little bit related to what you just said. My background is just 15 years in the international development aid business, so I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. Given the growing corporatization of the aid business, including the dependency on the big NGOs in Australia on AusAid, and having to go along and stay quiet because the money they get is from AusAid, there is also a growing movement of different approaches to aid. One is called just give money. And there's been growing research to show that just giving money to a community in a strategic way can have as much, if not more, impact than throwing $1 million on an aid project. I was wondering if you have any opinions or you've encountered any just give direct aid cash experience, or any other models that you think do work that you've seen.
Thank you for that question. I'll answer that in a slightly roundabout way. One of the things that I found when I was in the countries I visited for this book, and I've travelled to other places around the world for other projects, was that many people said to me, this is not a uniform view, but we don't want any aid at all. Now, there are some communities in some countries, in some areas who need an assistance in some way. Where that money comes from, how that works is a different question. But one of the problems I think has become, and as you rightly addressed in your question, was that in places like PNG, I saw on the ground in the areas where the Australian government through AusAid has apparently, supposedly, according to their website, has given lots of money. There's no evidence of what actually that's achieved. And that's for a range of reasons: corruption, inertia, a lot of factors. When I was in PNG, what struck me was the fact that after decades of what Australia has been doing in that country, apart from, I think, mining, assisting Australian mining companies in getting profits for them back here in Australia or elsewhere, is that the aid model does not actually work. It's not working. Now, in terms of whether direct cash injection, so to speak, I know that there are ideas around. I haven't looked that much into that, so I don't really have a particular view about that particular idea. But I do know one of the major failings of most aid projects, and I looked at this in all these countries, and my book touches on this, is so rarely do NGOs who are working there actually empower local communities themselves. So when they pull out, which they inevitably will, what's left? I saw this in Haiti, for example, extensively. They have all these NGOs who came, for example, after the earthquake in 2010. They tried to bring some kind of assistance, and some did invaluable work. But so rarely are there any actual seriously senior Haitians in positions of power or influence. One of the people who I have a go at in the book because he deserves it is Sean Penn. And he's made some good films, which we should ignore that fact. But Sean Penn, for those who don't know, set up an NGO and operates in Haiti. Has a lot of work in Haiti, does a lot of, and some of the work is quite good. But the classic case of where this model falls down is there's a national palace in the centre of Port-au-Prince, which pretty much partly collapsed during the earthquake. And when I was there last year, this happened to be a time where it was being demolished by a demolishing company, which was Sean Penn's company. And he had all these Haitians who were saying to me, what does that say about our sovereignty and independence when a foreign company with foreign white workers is demolishing our national building? Now, that's one example. There are many others. And I'm not going to say every Haitian doesn't want any aid or every PNG person who doesn't want aid. That's not the case. But too often I think we don't think about how our aid affects their sovereignty and their feelings of independence and how they think they should actually have a say on where that money goes. Not just the elites who are ruling in, say, Port-au-Prince or Port Moresby. And I'll finish on this. One of the things that should be quite clear is the Australian government knows there's mass corruption in Port Moresby. It's not exactly a secret. And WikiLeaks documents yet again released a few years ago show that the former Prime Minister, Michael Somare, who's now retired, was, I think the term that the US ambassador in Port Moresby used was I think it was either a cabal or something like that. Everyone knows what's going on. It's a racket. And the idea somehow that we are giving every year more and more aid to a country where that's happening, I'm not saying we should go give no aid, that's a conversation we should have. But how often, where are those conversations happening? Who's actually having a discussion about where our aid money goes anyway? I don't even see a public discussion about that. And we're spending $4 or $5 billion. I mean, this money is our responsibility to discuss where it goes. And the best way, whether it's the way that you suggest, which I've read elsewhere, or a more direct action kind of way, I don't know. But that conversation should be had. And the only possible advantage of an Abbott government saying we're going to cut aid, which I don't necessarily support, is if it generates a discussion that says more aid is not necessarily the answer here. The idea somehow on the left that we should give more aid, throw money in countries all the time, which many on the left say, is not working. So unless we have a serious conversation, which thus far has not happened, about where that money could go, then I think it's a problem.
So we're going to finish about 9 o'clock, so we might take a couple more. I think the gentleman just here, we've got a couple here. Yep, so we've got 3, about 4. So the gentleman there, then we'll come here, then Rosemary, and so just gentleman there in the blue shirt.
It's not so much a question, but just to add to what Pierre said about the 350 meeting tonight, that in addition to divestment from the super funds that we have, there is a very strong campaign for us to disinvest from the banks as well, the big 4 banks. So I just wanted to add that on Saturday morning in the Murray Street Mall, anyone with a CBA account is invited to go along and take action on the CBA on the Commonwealth branch. And in addition to that, on the 14th of December, there's a similar action for the ANZ Bank, also in the Murray Street Mall. And I just wanted to give everyone information that if there was any requirement, the website is gofossilfree.org/Australia or simply 350.org for all the information.
Thank you very much.
One more information comes out to me because I'm organising Saturday's event.
Do you want to just put up your hand so people can see? If you want to, what's your name?
Mark.
Good on you, Mark. Thank you. Thanks very much for all those people who came across from that forum. That's been fantastic. Thank you.
Anthony, thank you very much. Good investigative journalism is essential for democracy, so thanks for what you're doing. I think you've easily got another book in there too, because there's so many analogies with what you've talked about tonight with our food system, and particularly if you're talking to the extent to which it is being controlled by the chemical corporations, with Monsanto, of course, spearheading a group of, well, I talk about the big 6. We've got some big stuff happening here in Western Australia, and it's flying under the radar to a large extent, and I don't really understand why. We have our state government, together with the GRDC, which is federal, in partnership with Monsanto, and seems to be no public acknowledgement of that, and that's something that needs to be rolled back.
somehow. Similarly, it's early days with the lifting of the GM crop moratorium here in Western Australia, and starting the 10th of February next year, we have a court case happening, which is a farmer-farmer one. So we have one farmer having to battle this out because the legislature basically has failed him. So what can we do? I think it's still early enough for us to do something and be very active here. I'm just looking
Can I
for
just ask, could you just
suggestions.
mention the campaign if people are interested in that one? Is that that's...
The particular farmer's name is Steve Marsh. He's a certified organic farmer down in Kojana. And the issue is that the GM canola from next door allegedly blew over about a couple of k's of his farm and he lost his certification. The GM industry is really pushing, for GM contaminant, basically for the integrity of the organic standard to be done away with, to allow GM contamination. The other thing that I see them pushing for is to do away with the Act, the GM Crops Free Areas Act that we have here in Western Australia, that allows us to say, okay, well, you've approved it federally, but we here don't want this stuff in our backyard. It's all about trade. As you said, our food regulators have a conflict of interest with safety as well as trade. There's a lot of stuff that needs an overhaul.
Certainly when I was writing the book, people often said to me, you're going to cover these issues, and I had to sheepishly say, look, I'm not avoiding them, but couldn't cover everything. One of the issues I think, and Scott's constantly going to work on this, is the upcoming serious issues about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement between Australia and many countries in our region, including here. And I think this is a trade deal which is attempting to gut the reality of the ability for local producers and others to actually gain their own rights by multinationals from the US. I think Scott can maybe say a few words about this, because it's an issue which hasn't got much press, but it certainly, hopefully will, and it needs to. And I think the issue of, I don't have a lot more to say apart from I agree with you, these issues need to be very small. How do they get done? I think more journalists should write about them. I think that there's certainly, I don't plug the Guardian because I write for them, but the Guardian is a space which reaches a lot of people and certainly is open, I think, to these kind of discussions, and we publish possibly articles or news stories about it. It has a popular readership now. It's not an alternative publication, it's a mainstream publication really, and others. So don't be afraid to contact journalists and others to hope. I'm not saying they're all going to say yes, but it's an issue which we need to think about, and I'm aware that certainly in Europe and the US this debate is far more advanced than it is here. But do you want to say something, Scott, about the TPPA? Because I think that ties into those questions.
I would also say the best thing that we can do to raise the profile of the issues that you brought to us there is exactly what you're doing, linking farmers with people in the city, reminding us where our food comes from. I actually think the work that you've been doing with Steve and with others, the stuff that we put together during the election campaign, has already actually had quite a big impact. So we've got to keep doing the stuff that's working. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, who's heard of it? Yeah, in this room. So I walked down Hay Street Mall and asked a random sample of 60 people, who's heard of it? No hand's going to go up. So that's part of the problem, I suppose. But it is probably the most current and pressing example of that transition, the balance of power between corporations and governments, that would allow, in its worst incarnation, corporations to sue governments if they pass laws that they don't like. So it's effectively a mutated piece of the World Trade Organization, the so-called Uruguay round of negotiations that broke down well over a decade ago, that effectively the US government is pressing the countries of the Pacific Rim, partly in an effort to exclude and lock China out from multilateral trading blocs and to sort of shore up the US government's power. It's being written by lobbyists for pharmaceutical companies, media companies and content developers in the United States, and effectively would have a very, very serious impact on Australia and on other industrialising countries in the region. For example, an attack on the pharmaceutical benefits scheme It's basically companies trying to lock in profits along the general line of the dynamics exposed in this book. So we're trying to do our bit. When Parliament goes back, we're trying to open it up, calling our trade negotiators to one of the committees. That's one of the ways that you can use the levers of Parliament to just find stuff out. Because at the moment, the whole thing's being negotiated on the cover of darkness. They won't release the text. But we actually have, in the larger kind of global sense, quite a good record of knocking these agreements over. You know, there's plenty of hope. Anybody remembered ACTA? Stuffed. You know, so then that DNA migrates into the TPP. These things never quite go to sleep. But we do have a reasonable record globally, actually, of checking these things and holding them back.
We might do a couple of questions more. I think, Rose, we might do one or two more and then we'll wind up. Thank you.
So I guess my question is a little bit more philosophical. So behind all of these issues, I think there's things that consist of matters of acquisitiveness and greed. And I wonder if you think that there's a way that we can open up that discussion. Now, this September we rolled out a program across Western Australia through the Uniting Church called Enough is Enough. I can remember in the 70s when that book was published by Taylor or someone, and about enough is enough. But we've gone on all of this time to keep on accumulating, and we haven't ever challenged the philosophy or the, I don't know, it's really a theology in my opinion, because I come from the church. But do you think there's a way that we can open up that discussion across society broadly? Because I do think it's the underlying premise that we come from in this country at least.
I agree with you, those discussions are not really happening, and I think unlike someone who I speak as an atheist Jew, I mention that because so often I think in many parts of the way religion is discouraged, and the idea people have faith is discouraged, and the so-called New Atheist movement, Mr. Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, are fundamentally opposed on so many levels. I think they are inherently incredibly intolerant. There's too much process, I think, in a very naive way, including on Glorious ABC, who seems to love talking about them every day. And the reason I mention that is because those kind of discussions should not be, I'm not saying led by religious people necessarily, but religious people, which most Australians do call themselves. The census says 70% of Australians are Christian. Now, what that means, who the hell knows? Everyone's going to be different, of course. Maybe it just means that you were brought up in a Christian home where you go to church once a year on Christmas Eve. Who knows? But I mention that because those sort of philosophical arguments, it's almost like now those conversations really only happen in a religious context, even a liberal religious context. And that can be widened out. I don't see why it can't be. I think those conversations are happening here and there, but I'd like to bring a far greater connection between those who feel very militant atheists, for want of a better expression, and religious people who can come together and talk about the philosophical basis of what a society should look like. Those conversations are not really happening now. The camps are very separate. And that, I think, is partly a result of 9/11, and also the result, I think, of the New Atheist movement that's very, in my view, intolerant of those who have religious faith. And I have no religious faith, but I believe that people have the right to it. And if it helps them develop or get through life or thrive in life, then so be it. So I love those conversations to happen, and I think the book that I wrote this year, in fact, was part of that. For God's sake, it was a conversation between a Christian, Muslim, Jew, and atheist. I'm sort of an atheist Jew, so I'm straddling two camps in that, rudely. It's about saying that you can have a conversation about issues respectfully and talk about the philosophical basis of life, which is what the four of us do, Jane Karun and a few other people. You'll know Jane she writes in the press a lot. And those conversations should be had. So, yes, I think they're possible and they should happen more.
I'm going to, Alan the bookseller, Crow Books, for those of you who just come here, best small bookshop in town. Do you want a question, Alan?
I just want to sort of relate to that. It seemed to me that this election, everyone sort of shifted back to the right out of fear of losing their quality of life, whatever that is that they were it was actually going to cost to bring back their life a bit. I can understand how that exists in Australia, but how does it happen in somewhere like America where it's been so clearly shown over the last sort of 3 or 4 years what corporate America did to poor people and general run-of-the-mill Americans, and yet it hasn't changed anything there. So I can sort of understand why everyone would lurch back to the right here to protect their wealth. How can that happen in America where they've seen so blatantly what happened? That doesn't give me much hope when I see it.
I've been to America in years and years, but I think what's happening in the United States is that we're seeing almost the balkanisation of the country and a fundamental misdiagnosis of what happened during the global financial crisis and before that, in that the movement, kind of populist movement that rose out of the global financial crisis, for heaven's sake, ended up being the Tea Party, which is being bankrolled by these fossil billionaires who have, wrecked the Republican Party accidentally, which is also kind of funny, but are bankrolled in a large part, them and their cohorts, everything that we're sort of fighting against here. And I think in the United States, it's difficult, I suppose, to summarise. I'm going to sit down without having answered your question, by the way, because it's too complex for me to get to at this stage in the evening. But that some of the best dissidents and the smartest and the sharpest dissident voices come out of the United States, and also some of the dumbest, most bang your head onto the table stuff comes out as well. If you can, there's a book called Rich People Things, which I just gave Chantal. Have you read that yet?
First chapter, yeah.
Oh, have you got it here?
Yeah.
Shout out the author, because I've forgotten his name. Really sharp, wonderful analysis. I don't know if it's quite a Marxist analysis, but it's getting pretty close. Strong class underpinnings. Chris Layman. I don't know if anybody's come up. Rich People Things, Secrets of the Predator Class. Really very, very funny and sharp look on what's happening in the United States at the moment. Plenty of cause for hope as well.
I'll answer briefly at this tail end of the evening. I think what's happened to the States is that many so-called liberals, American liberals or leftists, not enough, but too many have been disillusioned with what Obama actually meant. Obama is a head of a Democratic Party which is as corporatised as the Republicans. And I think, unfortunately, Obama very cleverly, through a range of different ways, less effective now, I think at the beginning of his second term, has muted a lot of criticism because it was almost saying, well, the other guys are going to be far worse on a range of issues: healthcare, domestic policy, foreign affairs, etc. And one of the things that's become very clear to anyone who follows US politics, which I do, and I've written about it extensively and spent time there, is to say that there is a crisis of major party politics there, as there is in many countries, including our own. There's no serious third party. There are third parties that exist, or third individuals who have run, everyone from a Ralph Nader to a Ross Perot, who are different sides of politics, to put it mildly. What's fascinating in the US is the rise of libertarianism, within the Republican Party, but also on certain other issues as well. I personally, people like Ron Paul and Rand Paul. Now, on the vast majority of issues, not these social issues, I fundamentally oppose what they stand for. They're incredibly intolerant on gay rights, abortion, etc. On the other hand, they say things like we should cut all aid to Israel. I go, well, that's a good idea. And they're also very opposed to the surveillance state. So again, I wouldn't vote for them if I lived in America. My point being that there's as I think Scott rightly said, a fracturing of US political politics. And if anything, I'm hoping that the disillusionment that a lot of liberals in the US have towards Obama is actually put into, the energy is put into something wiser than simply hoping there's going to be a new hope who appears in 2016. The idea that Hillary Clinton is perceived as a front-runner says all you need to know about the Democrat Party. It's broken. It could win an election. It may well win an election in 2016 if the Republicans keep on tearing themselves apart, which they are. But at the same time, I also, on the one hand, think the Tea Party is incredibly instructive. Again, I'm not someone who would vote for them, of course, if I lived there. But one of the things, and I very much agree with Chomsky when he talks about the Tea Party, he says to disparage them actually is a mistake. The leadership is, as Scott rightly says, bought and funded by the Koch brothers and others, the rich billionaires. But many of the issues that Tea Party supporters talk about are working class issues. They're not simply about saying that let's destroy the world and bomb Muslim countries. They're saying the fact that we are suffering economically. Now they're taking that to an extension in a way I don't agree with at all, to a Tea Party Republican style solution, so to speak. But what they're arguing and what they're talking about is healthcare problems and economic problems and job issues. That's relevant for any party or individual that cares about the future of an equitable society. So to me, too much of the world on the left laughs at Tea Party supporters mistakenly in the thought somehow, how stupid are these people? How could you be, say, suffering from healthcare and not support the idea of Obama healthcare? Yes, on one hand that seems odd. I grant you that, not that Obama's healthcare particularly is great anyway. But it's better than what a lot of people have. But I think there is a sense somehow that looking for that alternative view, the Democrats are not providing that. And elements of the Tea Party are seen to provide that. And that should provide a crisis of identity about what actually all the working class people want in their politics.
It's 9 o'clock. I think we'll conclude here.
Come on, I've got a really quick one.
Oh, good one. Go.
All right, it's convenient that it's me asking last because Anthony's one of my favourite authors, and the question is one. Look, Anthony's writings over the years have led me to a lot of the books that I've read that have led me to being here, right? And you mentioned two of the most important books that I've ever read before, Jeremy Skahill's Blackwater and Naomi Klein's A Shock Doctrine. What I want from the two of you is your 5 favourite books that we should all go read.
And you can't mention your own.
Yeah. 5 on top of my head is challenging. My favourite book, and I feel like it's a bit of a cliche, but it's 1984. Orwell, I think it's timeless, I think it's brilliant, it certainly has dated, but it hasn't. I do often say The Shock Doctor, and I also have to come back to you with my 3. I actually was asked to do this list a few weeks ago, and I've forgotten everything I've said. Scott? Hold that thought, I'll come back to another one. I mean, I said one of them, which is Orwell's 1984. Actually, no, I think name 2. John Pilcher's Heroes, which is great. He's obviously written a number of great books. I think his early ones are, I like his old stuff and more than his new stuff, but I think his work is, he's actually got a new film coming out next year, you may have heard of, called Utopia, which is going to be about Indigenous Australia and the intervention, which I haven't seen, but I know that it has great people who are assisting him, Chris Graham amongst others. And that's going to be fascinating and hard-hitting. I've named you 2. I'll come back with 3. Scott?
Be a tiny bit unorthodox here and mix it up. So one of them, just because I just read it and it made a very strong impression, is that one. Really, read Rich People Things, it's awesome. Can I have some fiction on my list? Is that allowed? Okay.
He did.
He did? He did too, okay. So Maya Pilger, including from his kind of early work, is Secret Country. That popped my head open. I read that on the bus from Sydney to Jabiluka. Which gives you enough time to read it because it's as thick as a paving slab and in very fine print. And it kind of showed me the country that I was living in like I'd never seen it before. The Art of War, very, very old Chinese military text about people who are pretty over centuries of conflict, learning how to resolve conflict without mass murder. It's a profound kind of Taoist approach to warfare. Has some very interesting stuff in it. Neuromancer is my favourite fiction work. If you want to read Neuromancer by William Gibson, which was written in 1984 and was meant to be set in the mid-21st century, actually is set in 1984. He was a big fan of George Orwell's, and he writes about what technology is doing to itself and to us. It's actually a really, really instructive text. I'm up to 4. Now we have 6 by A and L, just because it's really gorgeous kids and anything by Dr. Seuss.
Have you got more? Now, Alan, you've got all these books, haven't you?
There you go.
You buy them from Alan. Any more?
I'll have to get back to people. I'm having a mental blank after a long night, so forgive me. But
Are you a Chris Hedges fan, Anthony?
Sorry?
You a Chris Hedges fan?
I am. Yes.
All right, Colin, rant off a few names.
He'd be one, Chris Hedges. I think someone mentioned Chris Hedges.
Benjamin Goldacre, Bad Science.
Any other suggestions? Benjamin Goldacre?
Alfie Cohn.
Alfie Cohn?
Small is beautiful, Schumacher.
Schumacher, yeah.
I've got one.
Yeah.
The Occupy Handbook, which has got a shitload of different
that's
people in it, and so much economic analysis. It's great.
It's a good book.
I think we actually all need to go home. This has been absolutely fantastic. Really want to appreciate everyone for being here and for all the amazing work that you're all doing in all the millions of different ways that you are. Thank you to these 2 beautiful men. And please throw a few dollars in the little box down there, and please buy lots of books. Yeah, Antony signing books. Yeah, this list of Colin's done a fantastic job of compiling a list of different progressive movements. So thank you very much everyone for coming along.